virtual ACAL hearing, so it's great to see everyone, and thank you again to our witnesses for joining us today. The subcommittee will come to order, and without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recesses of the committee at any time. Good morning and welcome to today's hearing on the harmful effects of consolidation on America's food supply. I'd like to remind members that we've established an email address and a distribution list to circulate exhibits, motions, or other written materials that members might want to offer as part of our hearing today. If you would like to submit materials, please send them to the email address that has been previously distributed to your offices, and we will circulate the materials to members and staff as quickly as we can. I would also ask all members to please mute your microphones when you are not speaking. This will help prevent feedback and other technical issues. You may, of course, unmute yourself anytime you seek recognition. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Across the country, food prices are soaring, families are going hungry, and small businesses are suffering. In the wake of recent COVID outbreaks caused by the Omicron variant and weather disruptions, people cannot believe their eyes when they see entire barren sections at their grocery stores. Across the country, workers are calling out sick due to the surge in COVID cases, truck deliveries and other shipments are facing delays, and people are panic buying, all leading to product shortages. Small businesses and food banks are struggling, and with pandemic profiteering driving up costs, our most vulnerable neighbors are buying their groceries at dollar stores just to make ends meet. And while prices are declining and are expected to continue to fall in the months ahead, we have seen versions of this story play out repeatedly in recent years due to deep structural problems in our economy. Today, nearly every link of America's food supply chain is dominated by less than a handful of corporations. We've seen consolidation trigger more consolidation, which has caused a domino effect through our nation's food supply. In the beef processing market, for example, 4 dominant companies control 85% of the market. The 4 largest poultry processing companies made up more than half of the market in 2015, up from 35% of the market in 1986. In the pork market, the top 4 firms control more than 2/3 of the market, double their market share from 1976. And according to Open Markets Institute, waves of mergers have resulted in 4 grocery chains controlling 72% of local markets. In 2019 alone, there were more than 300 food industry mergers and acquisitions. A joint investigation by The Guardian and Food and Water Watch likewise revealed that 4 firms or fewer control more than 40% of market share for the vast majority of groceries. They note, and I quote, "The size, power, and profits of these mega companies have expanded thanks to political lobbying and weak regulation, which enabled a wave of unchecked mergers and acquisitions," end quote. As a result, hardworking Americans all across this country are paying more as food prices skyrocket, particularly for meat. Large corporations have also squeezed out independent businesses that are lifelines to our local communities and critical resources of competition to these dominant firms. As Michael Needle will testify today, dominant retail companies have become so powerful that they've become essential gatekeepers for America's food suppliers, giving them power to extract discriminatory terms, better prices, more favorable terms, unfair allocation of products. Beyond the cost of food, this unchecked consolidation has resulted in the presence of choke points throughout America's food supply chain, creating much of the fragility Americans are experiencing every day. In competitive markets, there are many businesses of different sizes that can offer a variety of solutions in response to disruptions, such as extreme weather. If one supplier has a problem, others can fill the gap. The corporate consolidation we have seen in the food industry has destroyed that diversity. In my district, Warren Miller, the owner of Union Burritos, said in a statement for today's hearing that while mergers may create some economies of scale, show me the savings I've enjoyed when rocked by bottlenecks and price hikes in centralized supply chains over the last 18 months. In many cases, smaller, more agile independent businesses have left the market, leaving fewer and larger corporations that are unable to pivot quickly or offer different solutions to supply disruptions. And when a single facility controls a large portion of production, one problem with that, one factory's production process can have ripple effects throughout the country. As the American Antitrust Institute has noted, quote, "These food Goliaths can exercise their market power to suppress competition, which alone is problematic. But as the COVID-19 crisis has demonstrated, such concentration has also contributed to unstable supply chains," end quote. For example, in 2019, a fire at a Kansas meat production facility affected 6% of the entire beef market in the United States. causing shortages for ground beef and steak throughout the country. After the fire, prices for beef soared from $153 per cattle to $344 just a week later, while profit margins climbed 10% for the entire industry. In April 2020, the chairman of Tyson Foods took out a full-page advertisement in the New York Times to warn that, and I quote, "the food supply chain is breaking," adding that millions of pounds of meat will disappear from the supply chain due to closures in the wake of the pandemic. Last year, an organized cyber attack forced JBS Foods, which controls nearly a quarter of beef processing in the United States, to close all of its facilities in the United States, resulting in steep reduction of beef processing capacity and a spike in prices. And more recently, winter storms and COVID outbreaks have caused delivery delays and empty shelves in grocery stores across the Eastern Seaboard and jacked up prices for locally owned businesses. In the backdrop of these trends, there's also widespread evidence of corporate profiteering. Why? They are raising prices because they can, as Federal Reserve Chairman Jay Powell recently testified. For example, early this month, Walmart and Kroger, the two most dominant grocery chains in the country, announced they would jack up the price for rapid COVID tests following the expiration of an agreement with President Biden to maintain them at affordable levels. This is nothing less than pandemic profiteering as we enter the third year of an economic and public health crisis. With prices are rising, corporations are seeing record profits, demonstrating that they are not absorbing the supply shocks exacerbated by the pandemic. Instead, they're taking advantage of the American people to line their pockets in the midst of this crisis. In some cases, companies are using the cover of reduced supply to drive prices even higher, while consumers and workers suffer. Farmers, ranchers, and other producers are also earning less than ever before. According to some estimates, only 15 cents of every dollar spent at the grocery store goes to farmers and producers. We're in a perfect storm. Markets are monopolized, demand is high, Omicron is surging across the country, and frontline workers are showing up to their jobs under enormously stressful and unsafe conditions, often for wages that are insufficient to put food on their own tables or to pay the rent. Across party lines, people are tired, angry, and fed up with the corporate greed and runaway consolidation that are at the heart of this crisis. In response, President Biden has undertaken a series of actions as part of his economic agenda to rebuild the backbone of the country, the middle class. Earlier this month, President Biden announced a four-part plan to create a fairer, more competitive, and more resilient meat and poultry supply chain. This follows actions last year to address supply chain risks for critical inputs and an executive order directing a whole-of-government approach to promoting competition in the United States, including through the rigorous enforcement of antitrust laws. But we can do more, and we must do more to bring all policy tools to bear to address this crisis. We need to create choice for consumers, an even playing field for independent businesses, safe workplaces for essential workers, and protect the livelihoods of farmers by breaking up monopolized sectors of the food system. We need to pursue criminal charges of corporate executives who engage in cartel activity, such as price fixing and other forms of criminally anti-competitive conduct. And in Congress, we must develop new tools to address these problems as part of the subcommittee's work to address shortcomings in current law. And we need to strengthen worker protections, prohibit price gouging, and explore price controls as part of an industrial policy to address the outbreak of inflation for essential goods and services in industries that are plagued by profiteering. In short, we need an all-of-the-above approach to bring down costs and rebuild our economy. I very much look forward to hearing solutions to these problems at today's hearing, and really thank our panel of esteemed witnesses for appearing before us today. And I know the ranking member, Mr. Buck, is having some technical issues, so we'll turn now to the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Jordan, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't have an opening statement, but I would want to welcome our witnesses, in particular, Mr. Needler from the great state of Ohio. We appreciate him being with us today. I look forward to hearing from each of our witnesses and to the discussion that will follow. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Jordan. I'll now turn to the chairman of the full committee on the judiciary, Mr. Nadler, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding today's important hearing on America's food supply. Our attention to this topic is timely. As you noted, this weekend's winter storms impacted food supply up and down the Eastern Seaboard. The ongoing effects of climate change will cause more and more weather disturbances like this from coast to coast. As the unprecedented global disruptions caused by the COVID-19 pandemic continue, everyone is feeling the pinch of higher costs and higher prices. everyone except for one group, the giant corporations that control huge swaths of our food supply. Because of unchecked consolidation, a few large corporations own every link in the food supply chain. The beef, poultry, and pork processing markets are each dominated by 4 huge corporations. Their grocery retail market similarly is concentrated in the hands of just a few companies. This major concentration of power has had significant negative consequences for consumers and the workers in these industries. This consolidation occurred over the course of decades, and the statistics are startling. According to recent reporting, the market share of the 4 leading firms in beef processing rose from 25% in 1977 to over 80% today. And in grocery retail, the share of the 20 largest food retailers increased over 85% from 1990 to 2019. The top 4 grocery giants now control almost 70% of the market. The real-world impact behind these numbers is stark. Quite simply, corporate concentration in food markets is bad for Americans. Consumers are paying higher prices, and workers in these industries have lost their ability to demand a living wage. Anyone who has gone to the grocery store recently has seen the price of food go up, with the price of meat, poultry, and eggs rising at a clip that far surpasses the rest. Why? Because those are the product markets with the fewest competitors. Those are the ones dominated by just a few corporate giants. Decades of consolidation and wage stagnation has also given employers in highly concentrated markets the economic power to lower or even to fix wages in concert with other employers. Consequently, many of our essential workers who work in the food supply industry are not making enough to cover their necessary expenses like food and housing. The results of this monopoly problem are striking. 3 out of 4 poultry farmers live below the poverty line. A leaked 2018 internal document from the retail grocery chain Kroger showed that Kroger executives knew that hundreds of thousands of their employees lived in poverty because of the company's low wages. Furthermore, an investigation by the Select Committee on the Coronavirus Crisis revealed that in the wake of the pandemic, meatpacking companies prioritized profits and production over worker safety, continuing to employ practices that led to crowded facilities in which the virus spread easily. Consolidation also takes an economic toll on independent businesses. Often they are squeezed by powerful corporations that dominate the food system and control prices and output. A prime example of this is one of our witnesses today, Trina McClendon, who owns an independent poultry farm in Mississippi. I look forward to hearing her testimony. As Chairman Cicilline already explained, concentration in our food system is responsible for much of the supply chain fragility that we are currently experiencing. But that's not all. Not only have giant corporations helped cause supply chain problems, they are also benefiting from them. Throughout the pandemic, dominant businesses have exercised their power to earn record profits, while most Americans have seen their paychecks buying less and less. This is nothing short of pandemic profiteering at the expense of everyone else. Accordingly, this hearing is part of a larger effort not only to diagnose the problems facing our food system, but also to come up with meaningful solutions. To that end, I applaud the Biden-Harris administration for taking critical actions to remedy America's consolidation problems. With that in mind, I look forward to hearing what our distinguished panel of witnesses have to say on this critically important topic. I thank the chairman for holding today's hearing, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Chairman Nadler. And I know Ranking Member Buck is still having some technical difficulties, so I'll proceed with introducing our witnesses and then recognize Mr. Buck for his opening statement as soon as he arrives. It's my pleasure to introduce our first witness, Allison Johnson. She's the Sustainable Food Policy Advocate at the Natural Resources Defense Council. She's an expert on building sustainable food systems and the impact of food businesses' irresponsible practices on the environment. Before joining the NRDC, Ms. Johnson practiced environmental and land use law at Shute, Mahali, and Weinberger. Additionally, she worked with the California Certified Organic Farmers as an organic certification and policy specialist. Ms. Johnson received her bachelor's degree and JD from the University of California at Berkeley, as well as her master's degree in gastronomic science from La Università di Scienze Gastronomiche. Today's second witness is Michael Needler, the president and CEO of Fresh Encounter, Inc., a third-generation grocer. Mr. Needler's company manages 100 stores under many successful banners, including Save-A-Lot, community markets, and Needler's Fresh Markets. Before joining Fresh Encounter in 2009, Mr. Needler worked in banking and capital markets in Los Angeles for 5 years. Mr. Needler serves on the boards of the National Association of Grocers, the Food Industry Association, and the Finley Family YMCA. Mr. Needler received his bachelor's degree from Hanover College and his master's from the University of Michigan's Ross School of Business. He also completed the Executive Management Development Program at Cornell University. Our third witness is Trina McClendon, co-founder and owner of Trinity Poultry Farm, LLC in Southwest Mississippi. In 2003, Trina and her late husband, Rusty McClendon, built a commercial poultry operation and started full-time in the agricultural industry. Over the past 19 years, Trinity Poultry Farm has raised 129 million pounds of chickens and created jobs for the local community. Trina consistently ranks as one of the top poultry growers in her region of Mississippi. She currently serves on the board of directors for Mississippi Women in Agriculture and works to promote women-owned farms and help women enter the agricultural industry. Today's fourth witness is Joe Maxwell, president of the board of directors at Farm Action. Mr. Maxwell founded Farm Action, formerly the Family Farm Action Alliance, to advocate for a food system that works for everyone. As a farmer, Mr. Maxwell knows from experience the impact that consolidation has had on our food system. He has served in both Missouri's House of Representatives and State Senate and was Lieutenant Governor of Missouri from 2000 to 2005. Mr. Maxwell received his bachelor's degree and JD from the University of Missouri. Our fifth witness is Peter St. Onge, a research fellow of economic policy at the Heritage Foundation. Prior to joining the Heritage Foundation, Mr. St. Onge worked extensively in academia as a fellow at the Mises Institute, a senior fellow at the Montreal Economic Institute, and assistant professor of international trade and marketing at Taiwan's Fengshan University. For entering academia, Mr. St. Onge worked in strategy and marketing at Takara Toys in Japan and Harris Corporation in Florida. Mr. St. Onge received his bachelor's degree from McGill University and his PhD from George Mason University. And our last witness is Geoffrey Manne, president and founder of the International Center for Law and Economics. He is also a distinguished fellow at the Northwestern University Center on Law, Business, and Economics. Prior to founding ICLE, he was a law professor at Lewis and Clark Law School. He also taught at the University of Chicago School of Law and the University of Virginia School of Law. Prior to his time in academia, Mr. Manne practiced antitrust law and appellate litigation at Latham & Watkins and worked as a research assistant for Judge Richard Posner. Additionally, he recently served for 2 years on the Federal Communications Commission's Consumer Advisory Committee. Mr. Manne received both his bachelor's degree and his JD from the University of Chicago. I am now pleased to report that our ranking member, I thought I just saw him, Mr. Buck, has overcome his technical difficulties and has joined us, and now I recognize him for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm not sure I overcame my technical difficulties, but I have staff that did that, and I appreciate the staff for doing that. Americans across the country are facing a once-in-a-generation economic headwind thanks to the disastrous policies implemented by President Biden. An economy that should be growing and recovering from government-mandated lockdowns is instead stagnating in uncertainty over record-setting inflation, labor shortages, and a crippled supply chain. We can have a philosophical debate over the concentration of power in our food supply, and I welcome a discussion of Amazon's acquisition of Whole Foods and its anti-competitive pricing and delivery practices that force small independent grocers out of business. Amazon has consistently distorted market outcomes to the detriment of small businesses and must be held accountable. But to suggest that changes to antitrust law will heal what ails our economy at this moment is disconnected from reality. President Biden implemented massive government spending that ushered in 7% inflation. President Biden has refused to bring labor unions to the negotiating table to solve the crisis at our ports. President Biden has paid Americans to stay home and out of the workforce. Americans are paying more for their groceries than they have in decades, if they can even find the products they're looking for. And the responsibility for that falls squarely on the shoulders of President Biden. The food supply industry has not changed overnight, nor could it. The only change we've seen in the past year is a shift from pro-growth policies under President Trump to the tax, spend, and regulate policies of President Biden. The result, soaring prices and back orders for farmers buying needed equipment, labor shortages across the agricultural industry, and ultimately pain in the pocketbooks of many hardworking Americans. Unfortunately, this isn't the first time President Biden and his allies have attempted to shift the blame for skyrocketing prices. In November, President Biden claimed without evidence that oil companies were driving up prices at the pump. Instead of recognizing that begging OPEC for a production increase was terrible policy and unleashing the American energy industry, President Biden, with no basis, attacked the industry for alleged anti-competitive practices. This hearing may focus on a different sector of the economy, but it's following the same playbook. As I said, there are legitimate concerns about anti-competitive practices by actors in the food supply chain, like Amazon's grocery business, that could lead to productive discussions. However, if my colleagues across the aisle insist upon using limited concentration in America's food supply as a scapegoat for failed liberal policies, Congress will never make it to that conversation. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. We again welcome all of our distinguished witnesses and we thank you for your participation. I'll begin by swearing in our witnesses. So I would ask our witnesses to turn on their audio and make sure that I can see your faces and your raised right hand while I administer the oath. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you are about to give is true and accurate to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief, so help you God?
I do.
I do.
Thank you. Let the record reflect that the witness has answered in the affirmative. You may be seated to the extent you stood for that oath. Please note that your written statements will be entered into the record in their entirety, and I thank you for them. They were really useful, I think, to all members of the committee. Accordingly, I ask you to summarize your testimony in 5 minutes. To help you stay within that time frame, there is a timing light on your screen. When the light switches from green to yellow, you have 1 minute to conclude your testimony. When the light turns red, it signals that your 5 minutes have expired. I now recognize Ms. Johnson for 5 minutes.
Chairman Cicilline, Ranking Member Buck, and members of the committees, thank you for exploring the harmful impacts of consolidation in food and agriculture today. Our food system is in crisis, and with it our environment and farming communities, and especially the hardworking and talented people who make sure food moves from the fields to our tables. They say that bad luck comes in threes, but in concentration, we often speak in fours. You've heard some of this already this morning. 4 companies control half of the global seed supply. 4 companies control over 80% of US beef slaughter. 4 companies control nearly half of the retail grocery market. At almost every key link in our food chain, a few huge companies are profiting wildly at everyone else's expense. Our health, ecosystems, and climate are threatened by emissions, runoff, and dangerous chemicals from industrial agriculture. Food system workers, farmers and ranchers, and consumers are all struggling to make ends meet and stay healthy and safe, to be paid a living wage and eat nourishing foods. And the long, complex supply chains that we rely on daily to eat are extremely vulnerable to disruption by health and environmental disasters. These problems are united by a common theme: power imbalances related to size. So if you take one thing away today, let it be that size matters, and for more than economic reasons. Our antitrust laws attempt to keep companies from getting too big, because when you're big, you have more power. More economic power, but also more political and social power. And outsized power is a problem for democracy. Bigness can mean the power to unilaterally set agendas, to drown out other voices, and to extract wealth, labor, and resources with no meaningful repercussions. Unfortunately, in recent decades, narrow antitrust enforcement has sidelined political and social protections and set the stage for unprecedented consolidation and a precarious food system. Today, the biggest food companies have disproportionate power to influence who eats what, where, and at what price, as well as who profits and who bears the costs. As I mentioned, 4 companies control half of our seed market, and 3 of those 4 are also major pesticide companies. These companies and their predecessors that they've gobbled up have steadily decreased seed diversity while also promoting dangerous chemicals. Their dominance leaves farmers little choice about what to grow and how to grow it, and leaves our food system highly vulnerable in a changing climate. They also drive research, marketing, and lobbying efforts that undermine public support for organic and other climate-friendly agricultural systems that offer significant public benefits. These companies do not shoulder the vast societal health costs they create, and they are not held responsible for contributing to climate change and collapsed ecosystems. They profit and everyone else pays, with the heaviest burdens falling on the most vulnerable people and places. So, how do we balance the power and shift toward the fair, healthy, and climate-friendly food system we desperately need? It's going to take a cohesive and multi-pronged approach. Antitrust enforcement is key. We have strong, flexible laws, but we're not using them to address modern problems. And to succeed, the enforcement agencies need budgets to match the size of the problem. For perspective, if DOJ's antitrust division dedicated its entire budget to challenging a single major retailer, and that retailer dedicated a year of its profits to defense, the company could outspend DOJ for 70 years. That's not a fair fight. Congress should also step up direct oversight of the dominant companies in every food sector and examine the impacts and public costs of consolidation on the environment, workers, farming communities, small businesses, and consumers. Parallel tax reforms are essential to reigning in corporate power. And finally, we need agricultural policies and investments that account for distributional impacts so that they help smaller scale diversified farms and ranches. They remedy injustices that have stripped Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color of land and wealth. And they make healthy food more affordable and accessible for everyone. Concerns about consolidation cross party lines because there are so many people, places, and resources who benefit from fairness and so few who benefit from outsized wealth and power. So as we proceed today, remember, size matters. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. I now recognize Mr. Needler for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Buck, and members of the Antitrust Subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to testify at this critical hearing regarding concentration of the food supply chain. My name is Michael Needler Jr., and I'm the president and CEO of Fresh Encounter, an independent retail grocer based in Northwest Ohio. I'm testifying on behalf of National Grocers Association and the independent retailers and wholesalers that they represent. I want to start by noting that my professional career started on Capitol Hill when I interned for Congressman Michael G. Oxley, and then again for the House Financial Services Committee. Both summers taught me how demanding your jobs are, and I thank you very much for all of your service. We operate 100 grocery stores in Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, and Florida. I'm a third-generation grocer. My grandfather started the business in 1964, and I recently acquired the business from my father. Our mission is to delight our customers, nourish our communities, and inspire pride in our team. We serve a broad spectrum of markets from inner city to rural, and in many cases, we can be the only full-service grocery store in the community. When I was named president about 12 years ago, our stores faced very difficult decisions. We were confronted with incredible margin compression, sales shrinking. In many cases, the retail prices of our competitors were well below our acquisition costs. I determined that the only way for us to survive was to scale up, and took big risks to do so. Over the course of several years, I was able to acquire struggling companies, put together a portfolio of stores that hopefully would become sustainable. And with each transaction, our size and our sophistication grew. That brings us to where we are today. We have 100 stores over 4 states, employing about 3,500 teammates. In spite of our growth and scale, we still see that the road to sustainable competition is steep and potentially insurmountable. Our view is this: America's food supply chain problems are a result of increasing concentration and unchecked buyer power by a few dominant retail firms who force suppliers to discriminate against independent grocery channels. The result is a system that benefits a few at the expense of everyone else, including consumers, workers, independent retailers, and producers. Consumers have a narrowing range of choices to shop for the goods and services they need. Entrepreneurs and independent businesses struggle to start up and sustain businesses, and producers such as farmers and ranchers are forced to accept unfavorable economic terms, conditions, and prices imposed by the largest members of a consolidated supply chain. Although these problems are not new, the grocery power buyers have taken advantage of the pandemic and supply chain disruptions to further entrench their dominance at the expense of smaller competitors like myself and producers. Independent grocers like me struggled throughout the pandemic to stock most of the need-to-have products like paper products, cleaning supplies, critically packaged goods like canned soups. Meanwhile, large national chains have exercised buyer power to demand on-time, complete orders, and in some cases, secure excess supply. As a result, everyday Americans who rely on Main Street grocers, especially in rural and urban areas, cannot access products that they need for their families and are forced to travel sometimes at long distances to visit our chain competitors. These same Americans foot the bill for inflation pressures as dominant players have the power to refuse inflationary pressures and inflationary price increases from suppliers. Like squeezing one end of a waterbed, suppliers have no choice but to increase prices on smaller customers like myself. Due to concentration and relentless economic discrimination imposed by dominant grocery chains with buyer power, the number of independent grocers in America is declining. When independent grocers leave, small towns begin to fall apart. I think we've all seen this happen in our communities. Our government oftentimes will react by spending billions of dollars to reverse the food deserts that are created. And to be clear, we do support legislation like that introduced by Ranking Member Buck to provide tax credits to grocers to invest in food deserts. But this approach treats the symptom rather than the cause. Unfortunately, oftentimes it's too late for the independent, once an independent grocer's left. Prevention is the only way to stop the erosion. So over 80 years ago, Congress, led by this very committee, wrote antitrust laws like the Robinson-Patman Act to prohibit anti-competitive economic discrimination against independent businesses. Those laws are still on the books. But the FTC and the DOJ have not brought a Robinson-Patman case in over 20 years. It's time to dust off the tools, go to work to protect the free and fair market to preserve the food supply chain and Americans' consumers. Thank you very much for taking the time to hear me today. There are so many pressing issues that we face, and I think that the health of our food supply chain is one of those very issues. I welcome any questions you might have.
Thank you so much, Mr. Needler, and perfectly on time, so thank you. I now recognize Ms. McClendon for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, and the committee members today. I appreciate you calling me to testify. I'm going to reintroduce myself. My name is Trina McClendon, and I am a contract poultry grower in Southwest Mississippi. From a young age, I just always dreamed of being a farmer. And in 1985, I married my husband, Rusty, and I moved to his family farm in Mississippi from Louisiana. Rusty and I raised cattle, all while working 9-to-5 jobs. But we always dreamed about farming full-time. In 2003, Sanderson Farms, a poultry production company in Laurel, Mississippi, offered us a 15-year contract to grow chickens, which seemed to be an answer to our prayers. We soon realized that while we thought we were in a partnership with Sanderson, the truth is that our contract was very one-sided. We had no say over quality of chicks, quality of feed, and many other issues relating to growing a good bird. The fact that 5 farm deficiencies could bankrupt us, causing to lose the family farm and our home, created untold stress. After 16 years of bearing the stresses of raising chickens, my husband passed away of 34 years from a massive heart attack. I was left a widow and sole owner of an 8-house poultry farm. And I had to do what all farmers do in times of trouble. I had to put away my grief and get on with the job at hand, raising the best chickens that I could. This leads me to why I'm testifying today. Sanderson Farms is a vertically integrated company, meaning that they own all aspects of the chicken supply chain, which include, again, the quality of chicks, feed, and medication, among many other things. As a contract poultry grower, I'm responsible for the cost of building the houses, all the maintenance, the utilities, all equipment costs, and all costs to maintain and run the houses, along with a $1.4 million debt burden. Another aspect of contract growing is the tournament system. This is the way that growers are paid. This system favors the integrator over the farmer. It allows the company to maximize efficiency and costs, but it penalizes the growers by keeping our pay low and demanding that we continually make upgrades to the houses that keep us in debt for many years. Growers just never seem to get ahead. Because we are kept in debt for many years, it is a known statistic that over 71% of all poultry growers who solely rely on poultry for their income are below the poverty level. This leads me to why I'm testifying today. In August of 2021, I learned at the same time as everyone else that Sanderson Farms had concluded a deal with Cargill and Continental Grain to sell their company for $4.5 billion. Just 2 days after this announcement, I was handed a pay cut. In this take it or leave it relationship with Sanderson, they told me that they were going to reduce my income by 1/3. And whether or not I signed this pay contract, that all Sanderson growers only within the state of Mississippi would receive this pay cut. After this, I decided to speak out as a whistleblower to shed light on the abuses by Sanderson and other integrators in the contract grower model. I reached out through RAFI and the Government Accountability Project, and they put me in touch with Senator Grassley's staff so that I can make a whistleblower disclosure about the problems that I and other growers faced with this Sanderson buyout. So today, I'm here to make a request. I'm asking for 3 things. First, I'm asking you to stop this buyout and send a clear and concise message to Sanderson Farms, Cargill, and Continental Grain that the consolidation of our food industry is detrimental to the continued practice of a free and fair market economy. Second, I'm asking that you simply enforce the rules that were written to protect our country's food supply, and that you place a temporary moratorium on all large food and agribusiness mergers. And lastly, I urge you to protect all Americans across this country. And you can do this by protecting our most important asset, our food and the farmers who grow it. In conclusion today, I believe that I speak for all rural Americans and all family farmers across this country when I say that we love our jobs and we love growing food for this country. So I'm asking that all of you show bipartisan support for the women like myself and men who feed this great nation by creating a fair and transparent market for all American grown food. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. McClendon. I now recognize Mr. Maxwell for 5 minutes.
Chairman Cicilline, Ranking Member Buck, Chairman Nodler, Ranking Member Jordan, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for this opportunity to testify. I will be highlighting the on-the-ground implication of the heavily concentrated food system. I am the president of Farm Action. We look at the broader impact of market concentration in the food system, developing policy recommendations to bring about economic vitality in rural America. I have degrees in agriculture, economics, and law, and 30 years experience in policy development. My brother and I farm in Missouri. Economists state market abuses are likely to occur when the concentration ratio of the top 4 firms exceeds 40%. Today, the ratios in nearly every sector are far beyond this point. Beef is at 85%. At these levels, the understanding and application of supply and demand modeling fails to explain the market dynamics of concentrated corporate power. What we see are dominant firms exerting their power to extract excessive wealth up and down the supply chain. Today's grain farmers are trapped in an economic system dependent upon government subsidies for survival. When commodity prices are high, dominant firms simply raise prices of input. Today, commodity grain prices are up, but fertilizer prices have doubled. While the cost of manufacturing fertilizer has increased, these increases do not justify a 680% increase in gross margins for fertilizer companies. This spike in fertilizer would cost the farmers and the communities in Stearns County, Minnesota, over $8.5 million, requiring farmers to continue to rely on government subsidies. When commodity prices drop below production cost, farmers only survive if they do what it takes to receive government subsidies. The real beneficiary of this taxpayer-supported agriculture system are big meat packers who benefit from cheap feed. We call this model of government-supported production the feed meat complex. Meat packers either own or control the majority of the livestock needed to meet their plant demands, putting livestock producers in direct competition with the corporations they depend on to buy their livestock. This gives the beef packer the market power to slow their demand for cattle purchased in the marketplace, cutting the price they pay to producers. The majority of poultry farmers don't even sell chickens. They borrow money, millions of dollars, to build poultry barns to raise a poultry processing company's birds, hoping the company will keep sending them flocks so they can make enough to pay their mortgages. SBA determined the contract poultry grower has no independence and is under the mandates of the processor. One wrong move, one wrong statement, and they lose their homes and farms. As concentrated corporate power drives farmers off the land, the vertical integration of the food supply chain means the company provides everything it needs, no buying from local businesses. As farmers and businesses are pushed out, rural America is hollowed out. Farmers of color and their communities have felt the pain of power since the beginning of this country. Concentrated market power has continued the cycle of abuse. The experience of Nicodemus, Kansas, the oldest remaining African-American farming settlement west of the Mississippi River, and the stories of farmers on tribal land should be a part of your understanding of the impact of concentration on America's farmers. Food chain workers are in the most unsafe and unhealthy conditions at the workplace for some of the lowest wages. As reported, the oppression is so great that some frontline food chain workers have to wear diapers because their employer will not show them the dignity of a bathroom break. Dominant firms in the food sector have so much power they profit from a supply chain disruptions. Shortage of natural gas, fertilizer companies gouge the farmer. A fire at a beef plant, they gouge the consumer while cutting the price to producers. Today, consumers are experiencing a 6.9% inflation rate. A NASDAQ headline sums up the power of concentration in the food supply during a pandemic. Who's hungry? Food companies are gobbling up profits. Failing to include concentrated corporate power in any analysis of the current rise in inflation misses the mark. Blaming increased wages and increased government support during an unprecedented pandemic says to American workers, you can never make a livable wage. Doing so will cause too much inflation. The U.S. capitalist economic system will not work without government safeguards to ensure competition. The administration has a plan. It states they will invest $1 billion from funding from this Congress in local and regional meat and poultry processing. They will strengthen and provide greater enforcement of antitrust laws, including the Packers and Stockyards Act. They must do everything they have said, and Congress needs to take action as well. Our policy recommendations are included in our submitted documents. I thank you all so much for the opportunity to testify here today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Maxwell. I now recognize Mr. St. Onge for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, ranking member, members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to testify today. My name is Peter St. Onge. I'm a research fellow in economics at the Heritage Foundation. I'm also a former professor teaching corporate strategy, and I've worked at both small companies and large manufacturers. The views I express in this testimony are my own, should not be construed as representing any official position of the Heritage Foundation. My comments today, I'll make 2 key points. First, the data strongly suggest that food production, in particular meat packing as well as grocery stores, is among the most competitive and efficient industries in America, indeed in the world. Second, the inflation Americans are currently suffering across the economy is due to a series of administration blunders that unfortunately continue. This administration is scapegoating food producers for their own mistakes. So first, the question at hand, does food industry concentration, especially in the meatpacking industry, explain food inflation? There are several key data points that argue strongly against this claim. First, the food industry has been highly concentrated for decades. In meatpacking, it's been at today's level of concentration since 1994. And yet during those decades, American food has been exceptionally cheap. One study found as a percent of income, Canadians pay 50% more for food than Americans. Many European countries pay twice as much. Europeans are often amazed when they come here and see how cheap our food is. Indeed, American food is so cheap that we are among the biggest food exporters on earth. We export 25% of what we produce, specifically because our industry is so competitive and so efficient. The other key data point is profit margins. Across the food industry, and specifically in meatpacking, profit rates are among the lowest in our entire economy. Consumer goods companies often register 20 to 30% profit margins. This is revenue going to shareholders. Yet the top 4 meat packers have margins between 5 and 8%. For grocery stores, also scapegoated by the administration's allies, profit margins hover around 1%. For comparison, on the same method, Citibank is at 30%, Apple 26%, and Berkshire Hathaway, Warren Buffett's collection of folksy businesses like See's Candies, comes in at 25%. In sum, the numbers suggest strongly that our food industry, including meat packers, are among the most competitive and most efficient on earth. We shouldn't be attacking them, we should be holding them up as a model. So what is driving today's inflation in food? The same things that are driving inflation across the board. Misguided policies from this administration that have led to too much money chasing too few goods. These include, first, flooding the economy with trillions in deficit spending, which drives a wall of money up against an already struggling supply chain. Second, paying millions of people not to work or to drop out of the workforce altogether, and now threatening to drain millions more via vaccine mandates or the separation of work and benefits in Biden's Build Back Better proposal. Third, soaring regulations, including environmental and labor mandates, which can raise costs, reduce supply, and distort markets, all of which drive inflation, while incidentally tilting the playing field in favor of larger companies that are better able to negotiate these regulations at the cost of smaller or local businesses. Fourth, protecting union monopoly chokeholds over critical infrastructure, such as the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, which are essential to the flow of goods and inputs to American factories and to American families. Finally, this administration has conducted what I would characterize as a war on production, particularly on energy production in the form of regulations, mandates, distortions that can both hike prices and that can soak up an ever greater share of the consumer dollar, leaving less and less for the people who actually make the things we need. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. St. Onge. I now recognize Mr. Manne for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Cicilline, and Ranking Member Buck, Chairman Nadler, Ranking Member Jordan, members of the subcommittee. Thanks for having me here today. As Mr. St. Onge suggested, there are a number of possible explanations for the rise in consumer food prices over the last year. Increased demand driven by fiscal stimulus, disruptions arising from an unprecedented set of simultaneous supply and demand shocks, the incentive effects of government responses to the COVID pandemic, and an increase in money supply, among others. They're all interrelated and surely all have contributed in some degree to current headline inflation woes. But what's not a plausible explanation is increased concentration and the exercise of market power in the food supply chain. It's hardly surprising that shifting consumption patterns and the post-vaccine reopening of the economy have led to short-term frictions like backlogs and shortages and disruption throughout the supply chain, all of which are clearly associated with important relative price movements. But they aren't strictly inflation in the sense that all prices and wages aren't increasing together. These shocks are most likely transitory, and higher prices will recede when the supply chain returns to normal. That is, as long as sensible economic and fiscal policies predominate. But in the face of the harsh political realities of the current state of affairs, there's no guarantee that they will. Rather than accepting these extremely likely causes of the recent increase in prices, some, including the White House, have seized the opportunity to blame inflation on a widespread pandemic of greed and collusion by business, especially that of meat packers, grocery stores, and oil companies. Corporate concentration is bad for Americans is a nice slogan, but it's not economic analysis. Correlation isn't causation. It's no coincidence either that food and energy prices are excluded from core inflation because they are particularly sensitive to demand and supply disruptions and can be misleading. And yet those are exactly the industries we're looking at today as if they're bellwethers. Critics of American business blame years, if not decades, of so-called rising concentration. It's claimed that the increase in concentration stems from mergers and acquisitions over the years that were blessed by lax antitrust regulators or merely overlooked by agencies. These critics give the impression that in virtually all corners of the American economy lurk sleeper cells of colluding cartels that activated their plans just as the country went into lockdown. Under this thinking, vigorous antitrust enforcement will punish the colluders and stop the scourge of rising prices, but it won't. The purpose of antitrust law in the US is to protect competition, not to guarantee low prices in and of themselves. When demand suddenly spikes and the labor pool suddenly dries up, higher prices are a good thing and the result of competition, not monopolization. And it's entirely misguided to look at extremely long-term causes for short-term problems. Consumer prices have been sharply increasing for less than a year. Market concentration numbers in every relevant market at issue have been in place for far longer, decades even. I don't really understand how a market structure that hasn't changed since 1990 can be blamed for a sharp, radical rise in prices in 2021. The closest anyone has come to a legitimate answer to that question is to say that the ability to exercise market power enabled by those market structures is dramatically increased when demand and supply shocks occur because they can facilitate the pass-through of higher costs. But this explanation, still the best one there is, contains the seeds of its own demise. Its very premise is that there exists an exogenous demand and supply shock that's being exacerbated by existing market structures. By definition, the exacerbating force isn't the cause of the underlying shock. At the same time, even within the industries that have seen particularly newsworthy price increases, the subject of today's hearing, the complex competitive dynamics of those industries responding to disruption offer far more plausible explanations of current prices. In the first place, I should say it's not entirely clear where claims of dramatically increased food prices actually come from. It's not that food prices aren't up, they are. It's that food prices aren't up by appreciably more than overall consumer prices. And that's important because it suggests that explanations for food price increases that rely on industry-specific exercise of market power aren't supported by the data. And indeed, virtually every economist and scholar who studies the industry pegs last year's food price increases to shifts in consumption patterns and supply chain disruptions related to the pandemic. And plenty of those commentators recognize the concentrated nature of elements of the food supply chain, particularly in meatpacking. Yet copious studies explain that concentration, and none find a causal connection between it and higher prices. In fact, quite the opposite. Several studies find that there is market power among meatpackers that correlates with increased concentration, but also that scale and scope efficiencies more than outweigh it, sometimes by orders of magnitude. When you move past the tendentious headlines and political scapegoating, it turns out that the specific characteristics of the responses to disruptions from COVID are consistent with competitive markets. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Manne, and thank you all, to all the witnesses for your opening statements. We'll now proceed under the 5-minute rule with questions, and I'll begin by recognizing myself. Mr. Maxwell, I'm going to start with you. One question many of us have about rising prices is really why now? Some of my colleagues had just made an argument that it was really government regulation, which of course has existed forever, and spending under the Biden administration that are really the culprits, which of course ignores the fact that after the COVID-19 outbreak, former President Trump signed bills providing $3.4 trillion in relief funds and also gave $1.9 trillion tax cut to the wealthiest Americans and biggest corporations. So that money was pumped into the economy. By comparison, the American Rescue Plan signed by President Biden granted $1.9 trillion of aid to everyday working people in this country struggling to make ends meet. So it's kind of hard to figure out why that would be the cause. So that's my question really. Is it fair to blame current price increases on the Biden administration, or does the problem lie in the way that our markets are structured? And if so, what can we do about it? That's for you, Mr. Maxwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the question. But first, what we need to do about it is to look at putting a moratorium on acquisitions and mergers and increasing for further concentration. The Sanderson farm deal with Continental Cargill will take the poultry CR4 from 54% to 60%. That's the wrong direction. Or as Trina outlined, those farmers will continue to be in harm's way. We need to have a look back provision. I agree with Mr. Manne. If everything is going right, then there shouldn't be a problem with providing a look back provision like Senator Klobuchar's legislation has. I think that what we have to do is we have to take a strong review of what has happened in the marketplace, look at the profits within certain sectors, like the fertilizer sector, and make the determination if that market power has extracted excessive wealth from those communities.
Thank you. Mr. Neely, you're a third-generation Ohio grocer who's witnessing every day what is happening to America's Main Street in the face of rampant consolidation by corporate giants. What can we do to make sure that independent grocers like you have a fair shot competing with the big box companies? And what is your response to those who say that the independent businesses are looking for a handout or some special rules to just thwart larger, more successful competitors?
That's a great question. Thank you very much. Look, I think that we're equipped to compete if the rules are fairly enforced. I think we're asking you all to look at an enforcement strategy on the rules that are already there. If we can buy truckloads at the same lumber and same quantities that the large few can, then it's not really an efficiency. It's really a market power issue, right? So we can deliver product, we can serve our communities just as efficiently as they can if I'm buying a truck. Really, the incremental value of one truck versus 3 trucks versus 100 trucks really becomes marginal, and you can't see much efficiency gained. If we can just get the fair shake to have a level playing field, we will compete. We'll deliver product in efficient manners to rural communities, inner cities, and the like.
Thank you, Mr. Nieder. Ms. McClendon, thank you very much for your testimony today and the work that you have done to bring light to how extreme market competition has harmed poultry farmers like yourself. You noted that the poultry industry is dominated by a few vertically integrated companies like Sanderson, who maximize efficiency at the expense of contract growers struggling to get by. And you explained how within days of Sanderson announcing that it was being bought for $4.5 billion, Sanderson offered you a take it or leave it contract, cutting your income by 1/3. What can we do to help ensure that independent poultry growers are in a position to negotiate fair terms and keep their businesses open and successful?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for that question. In the poultry industry, one of our biggest burdens, of course, is our debt. This is the burden that keeps us from speaking out. The contract is very one-sided. And so I would ask this committee to, I'm not a fan of regulations, but I would ask this committee to protect the farmer. A business partnership, you negotiate a contract fairly and equally for both parties. In the vertically integrated poultry industry, the farmer is not given a fair contract. It really is a take it or leave it. And so I would ask y'all to look at that, that issue that we have as growers and see what could be done to help give the farmer a fair shake.
Thank you so much. My time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Issa, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Boy, I'll tell you this, I'll never forget when President Obama said elections have consequences, and I've never felt it more than today. I'm perplexed. What is it at the docks that makes 100+ ships sit out there, and what is it that makes those containers cost $17,000 a piece if you can find them, instead of $3,500, which was the rate on the last day that President Trump was in office? Is it some sort of mystical hand of Archer Daniel or some large wholesale buyer, or is it Albertsons or Kroger? Apparently, it's one of them, isn't it? Perhaps Mr. Orange, St. Orange?
St. Ange.
Thank you.
Yes, the ports themselves are a huge part of it. The unions, the longshoremen unions who run those two Southern California ports, they have for years fought automation. The World Bank came out with a study late last year where they found that U.S. ports are among the absolute least efficient on Earth. Those two ports specifically, Los Angeles and Long Beach, they actually rank below Mombasa, Kenya, or Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. We have atrocious port productivity, far lower than our major competitors. And the reason for that very specifically is that those unions have fought any form of automation in order to safeguard their jobs, which incidentally pay roughly $200,000.
Well, Mr. St. Ange, let me just, maybe narrow it. Your opening remarks, and certainly we know that there's been no major mergers in this industry over the last 1 year or 2 years. Are we having an antitrust hearing because we have a disrupted supply chain, some gaming, certainly by large companies to try to get their supplies, And I'll give you just a quick example for you to opine on. I don't happen to have one in food, but I can tell you that when I visited on a bipartisan basis with the Port of Long Beach, what I discovered were containers stacked up that were not going back to Asia. So ships were going back empty, but I also discovered a number of and this included the longshoremen, explaining to me that large companies were buying whole ships in order to get their goods. That includes Amazon and so on. So the question is the supply chain disruption, is the failure to deal with that on a national basis creating an advantage for large companies by definition and fixing the supply chain, normalizing the workforce? Wouldn't that be the best way to give the small entrepreneur a fighting chance? In a time of shortage, aren't you going to always favor the people like Warren Buffett that can buy a whole ship if that's what it takes to get his deliveries?
That's a great point, and absolutely. In fact, that's a theme throughout any sort of government intervention or regulation, is that it tends to help the big guys, and then the smaller operators have a much harder time of it. So without a doubt, right. Larger companies are able to navigate this crisis better than smaller companies. That's a general pattern, and so normalizing supply chains would help those smaller firms.
Question to follow up: isn't essentially big always a trade-off? And this is an antitrust subcommittee, so we'll move off the pandemic for a moment. Isn't big, including our witness from Northwest Ohio, who struggled to go from a few stores to over 100 stores, isn't big always a trade-off of economy of scale versus, quite frankly, coming up against the antitrust laws? Isn't that always been a trade-off where you struggle to get as much economy of scale, as much market advantage until or unless you come up against these laws, which are designed not to give you an unfair advantage?
Absolutely, and it's important in this discussion to remember that what's driving bigness is consumers. Consumers want lower prices, they want affordable goods that are of high quality. This is not some nefarious conspiracy. Consumers want lower prices. Now, large firms still compete very vigorously. Coke versus Pepsi, Burger King versus McDonald's. And indeed, the margins in grocery stores at sub 1% suggest that it can compete extremely fiercely. But fundamentally, we don't want to lose sight of the fact that the consumer's welfare is served by, in many industries, economies of scale.
Well, what last question?
No, the time of the gentleman has expired. I let the witness answer the question well beyond your time. So I now recognize the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Nadler, for 5 minutes.
Ms. Johnson, I'd like to ask you about how concentration of the food system impacts workers in your opinions. The United Food and Commercial Workers Union, which represents 1.3 million workers in the United States and Canada, submitted a statement for the record that described the impact of COVID-19 on workers in meatpacking plants as devastating. They explained that meatpacking workers reported to crowded and closed facilities where they got sick and died in numbers disproportionately high relative to other industries. At the same time, these workers are paid wages that did not allow them to cover their medical expenses. How does concentration impact workers' wages and their safety in markets such as meatpacking? And how can our antitrust laws and other laws ensure that workers have safe work conditions and are paid livable wages?
Thank you for the question, Chairman. And this question actually relates directly to the point that was just made around price and efficiency. When you set prices so artificially low that it allows only companies with access to large resources to survive, they have pretty much free rein to set wages, to establish working conditions with little repercussion. And so as we see sectors that have only a few companies in control, there's no meaningful check on the circumstances that they create for their workforce. So there's a limit and a balance to how low you can drive prices, and then a need to ensure that the costs of doing business are encompassed within that pricing model. In addition, there's a not a linear relationship between prices and business practices at large. So what you see in these large meat packing companies, as well as other dominant elements of the food system, is a decision by these companies to profit and to cut costs in ways that harm workers, that harm the environment, and that are really completely disconnected from the price issues that we're seeing.
Thank you very much. Mr. Maxwell, as Chairman Cicilline noted, many of us are asking why prices are rising now. Is it fair to blame current prices on the Biden administration, or does the problem lie in the way our markets are structured?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that it is ill-placed to blame this administration or the previous administration's response to an unprecedented pandemic, to blame the response of this Congress on the spike in inflation costs that we're seeing today. I think it's ill-placed to blame inflation on the backs of the working men and women in this country. It is to tell them that they cannot ever have a livable wage because it will increase inflation to too high of a point. What I think we should look at is companies like fertilizer companies. We've submitted to this committee a paper that we published yesterday that describes price gouging within the market. Yes, cost went up. Cost of goods went up for one company 51%. But they have chosen to increase their manufactured gross margin by 680%. Fertilizer prices doubled. Farmers had expected to make a profit. Commodity prices are up. That would be good news for the Congress because that means farmers would need less subsidies. But fertilizer prices skyrocketed.
Thank you. Ms. McClendon, thank you for your testimony. I appreciate independent farmers like you who continue to work hard to provide this country with the food we all need to survive. I'd like to know what we can do to make sure you and other independent farmers are able to stay in business. And what are the consequences for independent farmers and for consumers if the poultry market remains concentrated with just a handful of large companies controlling the industry?
Well, I feel that the lack of competition is not always a good thing. When you have competition in the marketplace, it allows for better contracts, better prices, a more open and free, fair market, as I talked about. You know, I'm not real sure exactly what y'all can do. Part of the issues that we have as contract growers is that we are asked to take on a tremendous amount of debt burden in the hopes that, you know, we're promised that, oh, we're going to make, you know, big money. And yes, we do. You know, my income is significant. However, none of that money sticks. And because of the cost of rising prices right now, the cost of propane is my #1 expense today. And just propane for the winter months will cost me anywhere from $20,000 to $40,000 to $1,000. And that's a tremendous amount of income pouring out of my farm.
The time of the gentleman has expired. Thank you for your testimony. I now recognize Mr. Fitzgerald of Wisconsin. 2 minutes, 5 minutes, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Manne, recently the Biden administration has looked to antitrust as a way to fight inflation. For example, in relation to oil and gas, and also concerning, as we were just speaking about agriculture and meat prices. Senator Warren said firms are too big, that Congress should expand antitrust laws and we should break up the big grocers. Another proposal is amending Section 7 of the Clayton Act. Others have said antitrust is too focused on consumers and prices and instead should focus on a number of conflicting goals. Even some economists, including Larry Summers, Jason Furman, have characterized this as a distinction from Biden administration's worsening supply chain crisis. Is it accurate that expanding antitrust laws as proposed by some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle would simply reduce supply while stimulating demand? which obviously would be a recipe for more inflation.
No, it's a good point. I think there's a couple of things to mention here. Number one, I think it's notable that Senator Warren's call to break up big grocers was aimed particularly at Kroger, which has about a 10% market share. I think, and it operates in a very competitive market. It's really strains credulity to think that presents an antitrust problem that we should be addressing, and that the cure won't be worse than the disease. But I think, to your point, all of the sort of suggested interventions that we've been talking about today, aimed at or responding in the first place to increase prices. Everything I hear today suggests solutions that would further increase prices. Now, there may be very good policy reasons to do that. It may be an important idea to protect farmers in certain circumstances, to protect the environment, to adopt regulations that have the effect of increasing prices, but they will have that effect. And I think that's the most important thing to keep in mind. That doesn't mean that the policies are inherently bad. It does mean, though, that those policies are raising prices. Now, if you're looking for things that raise prices, antitrust intervention into competitive markets is certainly one of them. So I think it's incumbent on us to acknowledge those consequences of some of the regulations we've seen. That doesn't mean they're inherently bad, but let's acknowledge what the consequences are.
Very good, thank you. If I could turn to Dr. St. Onge. Doctor, you have significant experience and expertise in inflation-related issues and supply chains. So I'm so glad that you're here today. It seems that this hearing would be better off examining how the president's favoritism towards unions is backing up the ports right now. I mean, that's real. That's a real thing that's happening out there. And how, I think, in more of an ancillary way or a more comprehensive way, environmental regulations have had an impact on the rising price of food and an overall effect on the supply chain. Could you give some examples of how those policies, rather than industry concentration, better explain the inflation that we see today?
Absolutely. Thank you. That's a great question. California really kind of makes the case on regulations, how they contribute to the supply chain crisis. There are really two areas there, labor and emissions. And those two together, they directly attack the supply chain at just about every stage. Truckers, railroads, warehouse workers, retail workers, all of these groups are affected by their labor mandates that can drive up the cost to employers, therefore making it harder for them to employ more people. They can also, in California, for example, under the CARB standards on truck emissions, those hit at the wrong time. They effectively took actually the majority of trucks in the country out of commission when it comes to the state of California. They actually wait at the border of California. They have to wait for a truck that's allowed in California to come to the border, which is about 4 hours. They transship, and then that compliant truck goes back. This is insane during the worst supply chain crisis in a generation. And of course, the concern is that those California regulations, there are Democrats in Congress who are interested in taking those nationwide. On the labor side, with the PRO Act, which does not look like passing at the moment, and on emissions, the EPA has expressed interest in bringing California emission standards over the rest of the country. If that occurs, that could spread the supply chain crisis far beyond California, which is key, but it's not the whole country. That could spread it across the country.
The time of the gentleman has expired. I will say, as I recognize the next witness, I will say, Mr. Manne, I don't think the antitrust subcommittee has ever heard testimony that claims antitrust interventions raise prices. That's the first time we've ever heard that. It's an interesting perspective for this committee. But with that, I recognize the gentleman from New York for 5 minutes, Mr. Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And good morning, everyone. I'm very grateful to our witnesses for joining us today. I also want to recognize, of course, the distinguished chair of the full committee for participating and holding this vital hearing, along with the chair of the subcommittee. Thanks to President Biden's American Rescue Plan, our economy is experiencing the fastest recovery in United States history. But obviously, we still have work to do. Today, the American people are facing higher prices, especially for food. The biggest corporations have sold us a self-serving story about why prices are up. They want us to believe that due to the pandemic, they've had no choice but to increase prices on the rest of us. But that's simply not true. Sure, costs are up for many businesses. No one disputes that. But last year, United States corporations made their highest profit margins since 1950. Consider the biggest driver of rising food prices: meat. According to the National Economic Council, since the start of this pandemic, 4 of the largest meat processing firms have increased their collective profits over 120%, or more than double. Tyson increased beef prices so much that although they sold less beef than before, they made more money. These firms have even given $3 billion to shareholders in stock buybacks and in dividends. The truth is, massive corporations do not have to impose record price increases on ordinary Americans amid this pandemic. Instead of paying their fair share of rising costs, they're making us pay the price, literally. Of course, if they actually faced competition from other companies, they couldn't get away with this. But as we've heard today, they rarely face competition at all. President Biden put it best: capitalism without competition is exploitation. Now, Ms. Johnson, you testified that key links in the food chain are controlled by just 4 massive corporations. For instance, in 1977, the 4 largest beef processing firms controlled just a quarter of the market. But today, they control over 80%. And as an investigation by The Guardian and the nonprofit Food and Water Watch documented, 4 firms or fewer dominate the markets for nearly 80% of groceries. Now, you opened your testimony by saying that although bad luck comes in 3s, market concentration comes in 4s. Would you care to elaborate on that for us? Specifically, how does the domination of a market by just 4 corporations enable those firms to raise prices beyond competitive levels?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. I'd like to talk about the kind of the rule of 4s, and then also raise some questions about it. So as a general concept, when you have very few companies who have outsized resources and power relative to any other competitors in the marketplace, their power and wealth become sort of self-reinforcing. They can undercut competitors with artificially low prices until they drive them out of business and then hike up prices once they're gone. They can enter into new markets, kind of self-subsidizing until they have their foothold established, and then use their resources to change rules, to lobby, to market, and do whatever it takes to succeed there at the expense of everyone else. And at the same time, I do caution against an over-focus on these numbers, because the other fundamental elements of our antitrust laws are qualitative. They're political, they're social, and they're about influence. And part of the problem with recent decades of trends in antitrust enforcement is an outsized focus on the numbers alone and an outsized focus on driving down prices with no political and social checks. So what we're ultimately seeking with antitrust laws is to balance influence with price fairness, and to ensure that companies bear their own costs of doing business, not the public.
The time of the gentleman has expired. I presume the gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Gates, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The American people are fatigued and frustrated by rising prices, by not being able to get the goods that they want or need. And we've had a Biden administration that has printed money like it's going out of style, that's declared a war on work with vaccine mandates by paying people to stay home, in some circumstances encouraging school closures or allowing them so that people are forced to stay home. They've backed lockdown strategies that have killed restaurants, causing more people to increase demands at grocery stores. And what you're being told by some in this hearing is that the reason that we are fatigued and frustrated at the grocery store is because of big food, not because of big government. And that's an assumption that I certainly think deserves challenging. I guess my first question is for Mr. St. Onge. Have the lockdown policy choices increased grocery demand in a way that might have spurred some of these challenges that consumers are facing?
Thank you for that question. I do want to take a moment to agree with the other witness, Mr. Manne, that antitrust often does raise prices. So I would second that opinion. Thank you for that question. Without a doubt, it did. Part of the impact was just the mix of products. People tend to buy higher priced cuts when they're cooking at home. A school cafeteria or restaurant might optimize with lower prices. And then part of it was also simply supply disruption. So there was a long period during the pandemic where there were too many cows, not enough beef. We also saw similar dynamics in lumber. So there have been disruptions really across the economy. And final point is that inflation itself tends to create a sort of illusion of profit. Many firms will book the goods they sell at the purchase price, right? Now you could argue they should book it at the replacement price, but at any rate, a certain amount of apparent profit during an inflation is an illusion. So, right, there are a number of factors either related to the lockdowns during the pandemic or to this inflation itself.
And in your research, have you looked at the extent to which the policy choices that have disincentivized work have impacted the supply chain and the amount of folks that are able to move product and onboard product and shelve product for our fellow Americans?
Absolutely. That's precisely what's been happening with the benefits, delinking benefits from work. That does not take dentists out of the business. It takes warehouse workers, retail workers, transportation workers out.
So the worst things that the Biden administration has done to the workforce are felt most in some of these areas that impact our food. Isn't that right?
That's exactly right.
Now, one of the policy recommendations that we've heard some of our colleagues reference in this hearing support moratoriums on mergers and acquisitions. But of course, we're the United States Congress. We only have jurisdiction over what happens in our country. If we were to do that, what impact would it have, if any, on global consolidation? Because I seem to see that particularly Chinese investors are consolidating globally. And if we were to deconstruct American companies, would that make us less competitive with the Chinese model?
Yes, that's a great point, and that would be the tendency.
And I have to say, there's a specific circumstance, Mr. Chairman, that deeply concerns me. So while we may not get bipartisan agreement for a total moratorium on mergers and acquisitions, the Smithfield Foods case study is one where I think we could get agreement. In that case, Smithfield Foods, Inc. sold to China. They sold to the WH Group of China. Now they're a wholly owned subsidiary. So the largest pork producer in the world, based in Virginia, that runs a lot of the pork brands that American consumers are familiar with, is Chinese. And I don't think that's good for our fellow Americans. I don't think that makes us more resilient. So maybe if we don't stop Americans from buying American companies, we could at least stop the Chinese from consolidating and improving their advantage over us. Mr. St. Onge, the regulatory environment has persistently put pressures on food prices. If the USDA allowed more direct consumer for smaller, more sustainable, more environmentally friendly farms, would that help people access more locally grown food at a lower price?
Yes, it absolutely would. That's one of the areas that the industry could really benefit from congressional action, is making it easier to enter the industry, particular for smaller businesses. We've got a couple witnesses here represent that group. So without a doubt, whether it's making inspection regimes more logical, with more input, whether it's waters of there are a number of environmental rules that cause risks or costs for growers, and so absolutely being proactive in that area would help.
The time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman yields back. And I recognize the distinguished gentleman from New York, Mr. Jeffries, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your continued leadership on this important issue, and I also thank Ranking Member Buck for his continued work and partnership to try to work through these issues, not as Democratic issues or Republican issues, but as American issues, to try to resolve on behalf of everyday Americans and the American consumer. Let me ask first, Michael Needler. You testified, I believe, that grocery store conglomerates have used the pandemic, to entrench their market power. And that process has hurt small and independent grocers. Could you elaborate on this testimony?
Sure thing. So, when we go to market, there's a couple of ways you can go to become more competitive in the marketplace. The first way is to be an EDLP. And I think we all know that the largest players get basically the lowest price on a regular basis. Smaller retailers like myself will pay a little bit higher on the regular basis, but then we'll have promotion prices that we pass through, or called allowances. There's also shopper marketing dollars, slotting dollars, so on and so forth, that the consumer packaged goods try to deliver to us. During the pandemic, because of the demand, they didn't want to promote anything, and as a result, our costs went up. Meaning, if 4 out of every 5 weeks we pay X, but then that 5th week we can pay less, we can buy in, we can be more efficient, and we can try to flex and compete. Well, during the pandemic, we definitely had no ability to get those deals. And consequently, our costs went up considerably higher than our competition on an EDLP basis. In addition to that, we gained market share. And why did we gain market share? Because I think consumers wanted a smaller, more convenient shopping experience, a cleaner shopping experience, a place that they could trust a little bit better. And that's all well and good, but in spite of the fact that we gained market share, the CPGs acted almost irrationally. They continued to allocate additional products to our competition who had lost that market share. Why did they do that? Why would they act irrationally, you might ask? And I think it's because of buyer power. And so they exerted some of that quasi-monopolistic power. Look, you can look at the chicken farmer in this panel who it poses a very good example, but then you can think about a major CPG like Procter & Gamble or Clorox, right? They are almost in the same boat as Ms. McClendon is when you're competing or when you're trying to sell to a huge organization like, I'll name Walmart, for example. Their power is so great that they can influence access to the products, they can influence the pricing of the products, and in the short run, it might feel like a positive impact for the consumer, but in the long run, I can give very real examples where Mr. Manne said that that it ultimately will impact the pricing, but there are in a negative way. I can tell you that.
Well, let me stop you right there. Let me stop you right there and ask that question. Problem. So, if in the short term these major conglomerates are able to extract lower prices, based on their concentration of power, but if that ultimately results in small businesses, small grocers going out of business, how does that ultimately impact the consumer? Isn't it logical, I believe, as Mrs. Johnson testified, that ultimately that will have an adverse impact on the consumer? Because once the competition is wiped out, the market will allow for them to dramatically increase prices?
Look, bigger isn't necessarily bad. We just are looking for a fair playing field, right? And so if they can use undue power to influence their supply, undue power then to take that margin, keep it, and apply it to smaller markets, they can wipe the small independent out of business. And at that point, and I've seen it happen, they will underserve the community with higher prices and higher out-of-stock conditions.
Isn't it also fair to say that the sort of small, more independent grocer who's got a familiarity with the communities that they serve can actually be more responsive given the great diversity that we have in America across many different measures as compared to if we just were served by the larger big box entities?
Mr. Chairman, I see I only have 10 seconds to answer, so I'll be quick. The answer is yes. We feel that we're very resilient and we can be very agile because we are smaller. We contract with hundreds of independent and locally owned farms to try to supplement our supply chain. We have multiple wholesalers who are, upwards of $30 billion. So we've got efficiency and we've got resiliency. And I think that ultimately could benefit us and has benefited us through the pandemic.
Thank you so much. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Apologize, I'm multitasking this morning like all of us, and I've heard bits and pieces of the answers and questions. I don't want to retread a lot of ground here, but I just do need some clarity, I think, for not only for myself, but for a lot of my constituents who may be watching this hearing now or seeing the tapes later on. So let's boil it down to the essence of this thing. Everybody agrees that we've got a crisis on our hands in regard to empty store shelves and inflation and all the rest. The food chain supply is a big problem. I have constituents in Louisiana who are spending half of their paychecks on groceries right now. It's not a sustainable trajectory that we're on. So we all agree on the problems. The question is, what are the actual drivers of this crisis? And, my Democrat colleagues tend to blame, corporate greed. And I'm not sure that is the best analysis of what we're facing here. So I know we have differing viewpoints on this, but let me just ask Dr. St. Onge to summarize as best you can. Is it corporate greed, or what would you say if you had to identify in layman's terms what the biggest drivers for all of this inflation truly are?
Thank you for that. Some of it is simply rebounding from COVID. There are shortages, there are price hikes all over the world. Now, the US is far worse than Europe or Japan. So something bad is happening here. And in my opinion, that is being driven by poor policy choices. So spending, paying people not to work, regulation, particularly on labor and emissions, and union chokeholds on critical infrastructure.
When we talk about policy choices, is it specifically federal overregulation that you think of the food chain supply that is partially responsible for the inflation problem?
Yes, I think regulations in general are partially responsible. As Mr. Manne alluded earlier, in any sort of scrutiny, rules, micromanaging impositions, these tend to distort markets. They also tend to drive prices up and supply down.
Yeah, I appreciate Mr. Manne's opinion on that as well. What about vaccine mandates, this idea that we've given out billions of dollars in free money under the American Rescue Plan? I mean, are those also contributing factors to this?
In my opinion, both are. Vaccine mandates take ever more workers out of the supply chain, and of course, benefits unlinked to work also induce people to stay home.
See, our view differs. The Republican response to this is different than the Democrats. Not to make this a partisan issue, but the approach to the crisis is different. So, our Democrat colleagues want. Sorry about that. Our Democrat colleagues want to. Their reflexive response is to further grow the federal government, to give more power to the FTC and the DOJ and other agencies. And we look at that response and say, no, that is putting fuel on a fire. That makes it worse. We need to get back to the free market. So. Dr. St. Onge, how would you characterize the effect of the Biden administration's attempt specifically on the vaccine mandate? I mean, we instinctively, sort of intuitively know that that's part of the problem, but these private employers are telling us that this is imposing a real hardship. And it's fair to say farmers and meat packers and truck drivers and other workers in the food chain are adversely affected by this. Isn't that right? I mean, is that intuition that we have, is that correct?
That's absolutely right. The National Truckers Association has been really sounding the alarm. A lot of truckers do not want to get vaccinated, and we need them right now.
How specifically, I'm running out of time here, but how specifically do you think Congress could rein in inflation and improve economic circumstances for the American people? What are specific policy choices? If we were going to do the opposite, what do you think we should do in a minute?
Probably, the single biggest changes are bringing competition to the pork monopolies. That would likely have a very quick impact. And then regulation really across the board against producers, standing down on some of this scrutiny and sort of going after them, and rather actually removing regulations. President Trump did do that early in the pandemic, right? Supply chains were creaking. There was a lot of concern. He sat down with various industries and said, how can we, the federal government, proactively get out of the way? That's what could be done.
What a concept, right? Get the federal government out of the way. Reagan said, government's not the solution, government is the problem. We subscribe to that. I'm out of time. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. You're not actually out of time. So if you wanted to yield that last 16 minutes, I just would say 70 seconds. Bringing competition to monopolies and more regulation is what Mr. St. Onge just recommended. That's exactly what this committee is committed to doing, more competition. So that's a good market-based answer. I now recognize Mr. Neguse from Colorado for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing today. Over the course of the pandemic, we have seen, and as we've heard today during the course of this hearing, that when major suppliers of consumer products are faced with limited supply and high demand, they prioritize their biggest retail customers like Walmart and Amazon over small and independent retailers. And those choices impact not only the businesses, but ultimately the communities that they serve. Independent grocers are more likely to be located in lower income or rural areas, including in parts of my district, rather than chain stores. And these communities are more likely to experience hardship when trying to access essential goods. There are businesses, many of which that drive our Main Street economies and are at the heart of our communities. But without them, we can expect to see the number of food deserts increase and employee wages decrease. So it's essential that this committee steps in once again to promote competition before it's too late. Mr. Needler, and I know this has been discussed already during the course of this hearing, but independent grocers, which, as you know, are family or employee-owned grocery retailers, often act as an economic anchor in their communities, attracting consumers, generating foot traffic that creates opportunities for other area businesses. Food and Water Watch recently reported that 70% of all grocery sales come from the 4 largest grocery chains in the country, up from 23% in 1993. And I wonder if you could expound a bit on what that kind of high level of concentration in the grocery market means for the ability for small and independent grocers to be able to keep their shelves stocked.
Thank you for your question. And I think your comment started out with quite, kind of the impact of independent grocers. I think a lot of us have either started our first careers in a grocery store bagging groceries, or we know somebody in our family who has. We teach ethics, work ethic, we teach accountability, and it's a great starting point for a lot of the communities from an entry point in the workforce. We also are a great career for many people with good paying jobs, with a good trade and a good skill. Cutting meat's not something that you can just come off the street and know how to do. We produce a lot of products in our stores, and we nourish our communities with healthy, wholesome products, which apparently, really is noticed when we leave. And when you create food deserts, all of a sudden someone realizes what they were taking for granted. So as you see the growth and consolidation of these power buyers, they are able to influence and undue influence over the supply chain and the suppliers. And if we could all we're asking for is an enforcement of existing legislation, and maybe we need to tweak it and look at something that was written 70 or 80 years ago. But the fact is what we're trying to do is increase competition by just having a fair set of rules. If I'm going to buy as much as my competition, then hopefully, that will allow me to have the same price. And that price is a very, very important determination in where people choose to support for their grocery choices. So yes, fair competition is great. I'm not saying big is bad. I'm just saying we want to have rules that ensure that folks like me can come to the table and get specific types of products. They hide under class of trade. So they'll give dollar stores a smaller item, and they'll be charging more per ounce, but looks like a cheaper price than something that's on my shelves. Well, I'm not even able, by the consumer, or the CPGs won't even sell that to me. That's not fair. I want a fair table set for me to compete.
Well, I certainly agree. And it touches on something you mentioned in your written testimony with respect to suppliers no longer allowing or eliminating the promotional allowances that they had typically conventionally done for independent grocery stores on many products. So in any event, I think the request that you and independent grocers are making across the country is a reasonable one for an even playing field. I think that statistic that I mentioned, the fact that we've gone from 23% of grocery sales in 1993 coming from the 4 largest grocery chains to 70%, literally almost 3/4 of the entire market, it's a sobering statistic, and it should alarm every American. And I think this committee has a role to play in terms of doing its part to promote competition, which in turn benefits our constituents and consumers right at large. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I would yield back the balance of my time.
Thank the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. I now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Jordan, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Manne, in opening statements from my Democrat colleagues, they said that the concerns in our food supply and concerns with pricing are due to, if I got this right, they said it's due to the virus, it's due to weather, and it's due to some large companies. But I didn't hear, and I had to step out for a different event. I just got back, but I didn't hear anything about the attack on American energy we've seen from Democrats. I mean, I sat in a hearing a couple months ago where a colleague of mine from the Democrat side of the aisle with oil and gas companies that there said, will you pledge today to decrease production? I'm like, what do they want? $8 gas? I mean, so everyone knows when you drive up the price of fuel, you drive up the price of every other good and service that the American people get, because it costs more to transport, in this situation that we're talking about today, to transport food products to the American people. I didn't hear any mention about the pipeline that they've stopped, which further exacerbates the problem when you tell American companies don't produce more, pledge to produce less, and oh, by the way, we're gonna get rid of a pipeline. I didn't hear anything of that, and frankly, I didn't hear anything. Maybe it's come up since while I was gone, maybe it came up, but I didn't hear anything about the record level of spending from Democrats, which has given us a 40-year high in inflation. And then my friend from Ohio, Mr. Needler, raised a potential remedy. I don't know if it's the right remedy or not, but it's a law that's on the books, the Robinson-Patman Act. And last time I checked, in order to bring that kind of action, it has to come from the FTC or the DOJ, and they're both controlled by Democrats. And I don't know any initiative from the FTC or the DOJ regarding that. So, I mean, I guess what's next, and we've already heard Democrat senators talk about this, is they're going to look at price controls, which anyone with any common sense in economics will tell you is only going to exacerbate the problem that we have. So am I missing something, Professor, or is that a fair summation of what we've heard?
That's pretty darn good. I don't know that I have too much to add to it. As I said before, regulatory interventions for particular social or political purposes typically raise prices. Now, they may be justified or they may be thought to be justified, but pretending like they don't have that consequence is silly. So if you're looking for a culprit, that's doubtless one of them, part of it. I don't know how much, but it's certainly part of it. You're absolutely right about oil and gas in particular. As you said, there's just no question that if you curtail the production of oil and gas, you're ultimately going to end up raising transportation costs and then prices for consumers. Whether that's a good idea or not, I don't know. But again, let's not pretend like that isn't the consequence. It absolutely is. With respect to the Robinson-Patman Act, I think there aren't a lot of areas in economics that everyone agrees on, virtually everyone agrees on. The consequences of Robinson-Patman Act enforcement is one of those. It shouldn't be surprising. The intention behind that law was to raise prices. So that Robinson-Patman Act enforcement would raise prices shouldn't be very surprising. But but it absolutely does. Now, again, whether there may be some countervailing benefits to that, I don't know, but let's not pretend like that doesn't happen.
When you spend like crazy and create a 40-year high in inflation, when you make the cost of fuel higher, and when you add regulation, you will drive up costs. So those are the three things that we know have been done. And it seems to me the Democrats are suggesting we keep doing all three and somehow, oh, it'll work this time. So I just don't see that. I think that's probably going to exacerbate a problem. If there are some real solutions that we can focus on, I'm all for them. But I don't think my good friends on the other side of the aisle are offering up those solutions. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I would yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, who is graciously managing a floor on the bill in a moment. A little out of order, Ms. Dean.
And thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for bringing us this important hearing, and thanks for recognizing me now. I also want to thank our testifiers, particularly the growers and independent retailers who take such pride in their work feeding our country and, of course, providing terrific jobs and choice along the way. We all know that we're in the midst of a global pandemic and an economic recovery. The last thing that Americans need to worry about is putting food on their table. I represent suburban Philadelphia, Montgomery, and Berks counties in Pennsylvania. In my district, the average price of food went up about 1.6% between 2020 and 2021. Mr. Needler, I was reminded when you said that one of my very first jobs was as a cashier and bagger at an independent grocery store when I was in college. Americans are paying higher prices for groceries. With higher prices, everyday Americans face difficulty. Grocery stores, such as yours, are also having trouble keeping their shelves stocked. In my district, we enjoy some terrific smaller, mid-size, independent retail grocery stores like O'Neill's and Delilah and Dean. It's no relation to me, George's Market and others. They provide jobs, they provide choice. They stimulate our economy. What challenges do independent grocers like these have in stocking their shelves and continuing to grow our economy and feed America?
Thank you very much for your question. The crux of my position today is that if we could try to, Mr. Manne talks about the short-term impact on Robinson Patman, but I think that you need to look at it almost like a zero-sum game. There isn't, if you push down on one side of a waterbed and the other side goes up, it doesn't necessarily mean that because it was rising on one side doesn't mean there's more water in the bed. It's just shifting. So if you have market power in a few that pushes the cost to the rest, it's a zero sum, but it makes it unfair advantage for the long run. And so the goal I think that we're trying to have is a very stable supply chain in terms of our pricing and a fair supply chain. So if what challenge we would be facing is as costs go up throughout the entire chain, from producers to transportation, we can point to a lot of things, and the gentlemen have already done a great job of articulating that. Labor, freight, all very real costs that we're experiencing. But the biggest players are able to resist that. That's good in the short term. But the suppliers have to pass that on. They have to pass that on, and the only people that they'll be able to negotiate, and really we don't have a choice, is the small guy like myself, and we have to take the higher prices. So actually, was in a supplier meeting the other day. They said we're going to pass this on, and we'll keep an eye on whether the competition moves their retail or not. And if they don't, we'll come back to you. I don't even know what I'm supposed to do with that. How do I explain that to my customer? So that's a very real example, and I can tell you lots of real-time examples of where I think we've got economists looking at big data, metadata, perhaps. I can tell you very real examples where I just need people to go to work and come to work. We've experienced an unprecedented turnover, over 100% turnover during this last year. Never heard of anything like that. Folks are not interested in going to work, and that if we could get people back to work faster, that would certainly start helping.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Maxwell, you discussed the concentration of America's food supply and agricultural market. Can you explain how this makes supply chains brittle and unable to withstand the shock of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yes, thank you for the question. With growth and expansion and add vertical integration, our supply chains now are stretched not only nationally, but globally, with one dominant firm or three dominant firms controlling that supply chain. When there's a disruption in the middle, one of the links breaks, then it affects or impacts a larger community. Whereas if we would focus on local and regional food systems, which have shorter chains and links, then a disruption or a break in a link would have less impact on great numbers of people. It would have impact on fewer numbers of people. So building resiliency into the food system should be a priority of the Congress, and looking at local regional systems to do that. And Mr. Needler's stores are very important in that system. He has a Yellowbird food shed, I believe, in Ohio that is a tremendous service during the pandemic. Not time to talk about it here, but someone ought to talk to Mr. Needler or the friends we have out in Ohio, how important that is.
And how all of these workers are frontline workers and how they've served us during this pandemic. Thank you. My time has expired. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. I now recognize Mr. Stube, the gentleman from Florida, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Maxwell, is it true that you were the Vice President of Outreach and Engagement for the Humane Society of the United States?
I am not currently the Vice President of the Humane Society of the United States. I was in the past a Vice President of their Outreach Engagement and Rural Development.
And is it also true that you advocated for Americans to eat less meat, saying that it is, quote, good for the planet, for the environment, and for the animals? Is that correct?
I don't know that quote. What I would say is this. What is extremely important for us in this country is to have a local regional food system that feeds our neighbors healthy, safe foods, that respects the land, the animals, and the community for which the production and processing occurs.
I'd ask unanimous consent, Mr. Chairman, to put into the record Brownfield Ag News, January 21st, 2015, title HSUS Maxwell says, less meat is good.
Without objection.
Thank you. Also, are you aware, Mr. Maxwell, that the Humane Society of the United States fought for the campaign in Florida against gestation crates for pig and swine producers?
I am. I believe they also did so in California and in maybe Massachusetts.
Do you have gestation crates? Are gestation crates allowed in Missouri?
Gestation crates are allowed in Missouri. On my farm, we do not have gestation crates. So, caging an animal, a sentient being, for their entire life in a 2-foot by 7-foot cage in the name of industrial agriculture is just wrong.
So the organization that you just admitted,
custodians of that which we have, and we should take care of those animals that are within our care, whether they're our sheep, our cattle, or our hogs.
Okay, it's my time. I'm the one asking the questions.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So you've admitted that you're the Vice President of Outreach for the Humane Society. You also just stated the Humane Society of the United States was responsible for backing the gestation crate amendment in the state of Florida, which systematically put out of business every swine producer in the state of Florida. So today in your testimony, you stated that 4 firms control, and I quote, 4 firms control 67% of the hog market. I was one of 670,000 hog farmers in the US. Today, I'm one of the remaining 64,000 hog farmers. And it's a direct result of the policies that you supported as Vice President of the Humane Society that put your competitors in Florida completely out of business. So you're complaining today that there's only 4 manufacturers of the hog market, 4 firms that control 67% of the hog market in the United States, which is a direct result of the policy positions that you've taken in your organization that you were vice president of, which has led us to where we are. And interestingly enough, the state that you hail from
that is not that's not an accurate representation.
Whether you do it or not is irrelevant. The state that you hail from allows for gestation crates, but it's disallowed in states like Florida, which has directly resulted in small swine producers in the state of Florida from completely going out of business and not being able to compete with farmers, say, in your state of Missouri that are allowed to use gestation crates for the production of swine. Therefore, I find it very difficult to take your testimony when you've openly advocated against the growth in the livestock market, and yet today you purport to opine on what is best for it. I represent a district with over 500,000 head of cattle. We don't have swine anymore, thanks to the Humane Society of the United States pushing for that amendment in the state of Florida. Yet here you are telling us what is best for the livestock in the United States. Mr. Manne, there's been a push by Democrats for sweeping antitrust reforms. They're making sure not to let a crisis go to waste and are using inflation as a justification for those reforms. The Biden administration is looking to blame problems like inflation and supply chain issues on anything but their own policies, and big companies are an easy scapegoat. I disagree with the Democrats' premise and approach, but if lack of competition really is the issue, then wouldn't lowering regulatory barriers to entry and promoting more competition be a solution?
Yeah, no, no question, that's right. I also agree that there's some scapegoating going on, that there's a much longer standing policy agenda, and this is an opportunity to be opportunistic and take advantage of the situation to try to promote it. But I will also note that very antitrust agenda that we heard some mention of earlier, that focuses on worker welfare and supplier welfare and small firms versus big firms, the neo-Brandesian approach. Again, I know I sound like a broken record. It will raise prices. We can debate whether it's worth that or not, but we cannot debate that will be a consequence of it. And we should judge the value of those kinds of policies in their full context. And part of that context is higher prices for consumers.
Mr. Chairman, I have a unanimous consent request.
Please state your request.
An excerpt from American Veterinary Medical Association article by Bridget Cohen, 9/15/2002, where the pig crate issue was backed by the Humane Society of the United States. I ask unanimous consent that that's added to the record. I also ask that the Humane Society of the United States Eating Humanely website is also entered into the record.
Without objection. The gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentlelady from Washington, Ms. Jayapal, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this very important hearing. And my colleagues, we do have an agenda. It's to fight for Americans to be able to have choice, for consumers to be able to shop at local grocery stores, to stop the consolidation of industries where that consolidation results in higher prices. That is the agenda that I think we are very focused on. And in many situations, it is actually a bipartisan agenda as well. And I appreciate that. Amidst the new pandemic wave, the American food supply chain is hemorrhaging. Products are disappearing from shelves or listed for far higher prices. Essential workers are subject to massive COVID outbreaks and unhygienic conditions. And in contrast, dominant food suppliers like Tyson Foods have record profits and CEO pay. In fact, just a few months ago, my home state, Washington, our state's attorney general sued Tyson Foods, Inc., Pilgrim's Pride Corp., and a number of other big chicken producers for conspiring to inflate and manipulate prices, rig contract bids, and coordinate supply reductions to boost profits. As AG Ferguson said, if you've eaten chicken in the last decade, this conspiracy touched your wallet and cost middle-class and low-income Washington families more money to put food on their table. The unprecedented consolidation of these companies in the food supply chain has driven out competitors and has ignored poor working conditions and increased consumer prices. As dominant food suppliers consolidate, profits normally funneled into local communities get siphoned out to Wall Street. For example, in the last 2 decades, Tyson and many others have acquired dozens of smaller firms. Mr. Maxwell, as an economist and co-founder of Farm Action, how has market consolidation in the supply chain impacted the profits of local farmers?
Concentration has stripped the farmer of the market. The fact is, the market is dead. We're not here today to talk about government intervention into competitive markets. Farm Action is here today to talk about government safeguards in markets that have no competition. That is the reality that the farmer faces. 1 or 2 buyers for their cattle. They're competing directly head on with their buyer. The majority of the cattle are either owned by the packer or controlled by the packer. And that's the same person that the farmer, the cattle producer, has to sell their livestock to. They simply, the packer just simply slows down its purchasing in the marketplace, lowering the price the farmer gets and put the money in their pocket. It's that way in every sector. America's farmers farm dependent upon government subsidies, and they're being driven out of business by the concentration of power.
Thank you.
They're losing their businesses and they're losing their rural communities. It's a hollowing out of America.
Thank you very much. Access to essential items has been particularly difficult during the COVID-19 pandemic, and there have been extensive outbreaks at places like Tyson Foods in my home state of Washington that resulted in plant shutdowns and even deaths. Ms. Johnson, as a food sustainability expert, can you discuss how the pandemic worsened the working conditions in the consolidated food industry?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. Yes, and COVID has created a set of risks in the workplace that we're all trying to understand how to deal with. It's dangerous to go to work in a way that it hasn't been before, and the dangers fall most heavily on those who are also poorly paid and already endure dangerous workplaces. Meatpacking in particular is an extremely dangerous profession with very high turnover and a vulnerable workforce. So we're layering on top of existing risks another challenge. And I've heard that this idea that people don't want to go to work coming up as if it's a preference. People are afraid to go to work, and they are trying to protect themselves and their families while also trying to afford food and meet their basic needs. The pandemic has shed light on dynamics that were already there, that have really been there since the beginning of the United States and our food system, and its premise of relying on exploitative labor practices. And so what we have now is an opportunity. It's not opportunistic in a exploitative sense, but it's opportunistic in that we can see what's before us. And this is an opportunity to make change and remedy the unsafe working conditions that so many people endure.
Thank you so much. My time has expired, but I am really excited that we're having this hearing, Mr. Chairman, and I think it's important for the American consumer that we fight for consumers and small businesses across the country. Thank you so much. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlelady yields back. I now recognize the gentlelady from Minnesota, Ms. Fishbach, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. St. Onge, in your testimony, you mentioned the challenges for entrance into the processing market, I believe. Such as achieving the economies of scale necessary to compete. An additional factor as well that that we've been seeing in the Ag Committee is the incredible capital costs that it takes to even start a modestly sized meat processor. These are expensive pieces of equipment that go into the facilities. And can you expand further on those challenges for a new entrant into the processing industry?
Mr. Manne may know the processing industry better. In general, the compliance costs, setup costs, all of these are far harder for smaller entrants. This is true not only in food production, this is really true. It's true in retailing, it's true across the economy. And in terms, of course, what we're discussing today has the potential to raise not only the compliance and the regulatory risks, or costs, but also risks on top of that, right? If a firm is sort of afraid of coloring outside the lines and getting into a lot of trouble for that, then they can often end up taking choices that are not only bad for the business, but could actually be bad for the consumer. So an example of that is that a company might be actually afraid to offer customer discounts because they're afraid of running afoul of some requirement.
Well, and maybe since you mentioned Mr. Manne, do you have anything to add to or respond to that question regarding the processing?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. First of all, I would point out that there's been copious studies on the meatpacking industry, on its history and economic consequences. And it's pretty remarkable how consistently they find that there has been increased concentration. I don't think anyone can deny that. That increased concentration correlates with some increase in market power. And yet there has been such an increase in efficiencies that it dwarfs the potential harm from exercise of market power. It's part of there are lots of speculation about exactly what the source of those efficiencies are. Everyone agrees that larger meat processing plants is more efficient, no question about that, but that doesn't inherently mean that many plants have to be owned by one company. So there's a lot of speculation about economies of scope, and there's a lot of research to suggest that there are some. I'll give you one example. If you are able to process and sell meat products from multiple different species, and you're selling to a wholesaler that's interested in buying meat products from many different species, you may have a much easier time negotiating with them. The marketing margin that the wholesaler earns may be smaller, all because you have access to a wider range of types of supply. And that's just one of many, many examples.
Well, and maybe it's a yes or no question, but are any of those challenges that are faced by the meat processors and getting into the business and are any of those related to matters of antitrust policy?
Let's see, difficulties getting into the business are not related to antitrust policies.
So expand, I guess.
The regulation, though.
Okay, and maybe you could expand a little bit on the regulation. That was going to be one of the other questions that I asked about the kinds of the challenges of regulation and how that deals with the supply chain.
Yeah, so I mean, I think again, there may be perfectly good justifications for this. Obviously, safety of the food supply is very important. But one consequence of that is absolutely extraordinarily high compliance costs. I would point out, for example, that the recent Biden USDA announcement of $1 billion or so to support small businesses in the meatpacking industry, a chunk of that is specifically goes to defraying the cost of compliance with USDA inspections and other regulations. Now, it is a very real cost, and certainly that makes a lot of sense, actually. It's the one element of that proposal that makes some sense. Actually, what doesn't make sense is why you don't do that for all providers, because of course those costs apply even at an even greater level to a larger processor. But yes, it's very real, and it certainly impedes entry. At the margin, I don't know exactly how much, but certainly at the margin it would impede entry.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman, yield back. I now recognize the gentleman from Maryland, the distinguished Professor Raskin.
Mr. Chairman, thanks so much for this excellent hearing. Mr. Maxwell, the administration itself recently observed that high levels of market concentration in the meat processing industry is a textbook example of how diminished competition hurts consumers who pay more, farmers and workers who are paid less, and the economy more broadly. Can you explain the role that meat processors play in the supply chain today? And do you agree with the White House analysis that the high level of concentration in meat processing is a problem for Americans generally?
Meat packers are for the producer and for access for choice to the consumer are the bottleneck within the supply chain. The number of processors, meat packers, or poultry processors is extremely limited today to 4 dominant firms. Therefore, they control the market at their processing plant. We agree with the assessment, as we stated in our opening statement, that market power, the concentration of the dominant firms, has to be part of the analysis as it relates to inflation and the increased spike in cost that we're facing today during this pandemic. We believe that there are other factors, which are some supply chain disruptions and that have increased costs, but many of those supply chain disruptions are within that vertically integrated supply chain that's within the control of that packer as it relates specifically to beef.
Well, some people seem to want to be blaming antitrust laws for inflation. In 2021, Pilgrim's Pride, which is one of the big producers of broiler chicken, pleaded guilty to charges that it criminally conspired to fix prices and rig bids for broiler chicken products. In 2019, DOJ intervened in a civil lawsuit alleging that Tyson Food and Pilgrim's Pride conspired together to fix chicken prices. Do you agree that aggressive enforcement of antitrust laws, or what we're proposing, which is strengthening of the antitrust laws, leads to inflation, or do you think it will help us to restrain inflation?
I believe that it will help restrain price gouging by dominant firms within a marketplace. You have mentioned the litigation's gone on. Oddly enough, Kroger, which has been mentioned here during this testimony, was one of the plaintiffs that brought a collusion case against the big poultry processors. So even the big is admitting there's problems within the system. Congress needs to act.
Thank you. Ms. McClendon, the poultry industry is a highly concentrated and dominated industry by just a handful of large companies. Your farm was directly injured by Cargill's 2021 acquisition of Sanderson Farms. Can you explain to us what the impact of that acquisition and merger was on your business?
Well, there's a couple of impacts. One, of course, the pay decrease that we're getting is going to reduce my pay by 1/3, which is a tremendous amount on all poultry farmers. Our prices too continue to rise. The price of gas, the price of electricity, the price of supplies like fan motors and feed motors, and all of those costs are rising for us. So to introduce a pay cut is extremely detrimental to us as farmers. Also, again, I just believe that as we continue to consolidate into big three, that we run into the issues that have been discussed here today, which is the price fixing issues. These large corporations have a lot of power. I'm for capitalism, and in capitalism, you need competition. And we just don't have that in the poultry industry today.
Well, can I ask you, why are people paying more for chicken when they go buy it at the store, but you as a farmer are getting paid less?
Because the model is set up so that Sanderson Farms and Cargill, Continental Grain can all achieve the highest profit that they can get. So they're maximizing their profits while we as farmers are basically tenant farmers. And, at times, that's what I feel like. It's like the big man's in charge and the little guys getting shoved out and will never make what they need to make to even survive.
Well, thank you for your excellent testimony, Mr. Chairman. Ms. McClendon's story is the story of countless farmers and workers across the country, and we need to get back to being in the business as government of aggressive antitrust enforcement so we can achieve what Ms. McClendon's talking about, which is real market competition, which benefits everybody as opposed to monopoly. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Thank you, Professor Eskin. I recognize the gentlelady from Indiana, Ms. Sparks, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your hearing. I wanted to share with you a little bit of my personal perspective as someone actually not as a legal scholar, but as a farmer who actually used to get on the combine, someone who used to pull the wagons. And I'll tell you one thing, and somebody who actually used to be in Fortune 500 America audited, work with largest company. And actually that what led me to run for Congress. If we continue this path of destroying small business with government regulations, we will have oligopolists control all of the sides of the market, which they control most. And I will tell you that government control monopoly is very dangerous structure because, they can hire very expensive CPAs like me and attorneys and also have lobbies to create a lot of loopholes and don't follow the rules. Actually, our environmental regulations, which are a lot of them unreasonable, and we want to have reasonable, created a lot of land restriction on use, and that's destroy a lot of farming. We're talking about fertilizers. We're trying to put fertilizer facility in Indiana, and actually I aligned with some liberal Democrats because we were trying to push carbon onto the Madrid fault in Indiana, and he was very nervous about that. So now we will be all dependent on foreign companies to buy fertilizer, and our prices are going to increase. The same we're talking about propane. I think Ms. McClendon brought that issue. War on fossil fuels, we'll see, will double the prices on propane, and it is destruction for the little guy. And I just recently met with some farmers, my husband in the Farm Bureau, and I met with some farmers, hog farmers. And I told them, okay, we do have a significant oligopoly problems. And I told them, why couldn't, I know it requires capital and access to capital of small business owners, very limited. I've struggled and been through that myself. And I said, why couldn't we just create such a, profitable business? Why cannot we create new facility to slaughter, butcher hogs? I actually was told that we cannot use that word anymore. We had to use harvest hogs. Well, I'll still use slaughter since English not my first language. So I go to the dictionary because it's ridiculous to say that we're harvesting hogs. But anyway, so I said, look, why couldn't we just start a facility? You have some people, you have some business people. And he said, oh, yes, we had some colleagues who tried to start one facility in Indiana. And they told me, well, wait for USDA inspectors. It will take you a year to get them. And then they constantly have to check these facilities. And if you are not a big company connected to the government, they're not going to show up. So only all big companies have political power and capital to control. So my suggestion would be to my fellow colleagues, if we want to put, all this FDA and USDA and the jurisdiction of DOJ and FTC, how much restriction to competition they're, creating, I would be all for it, because the government is destroying small enterprise, and we're destroying manufacturing, we're destroying mining, and now we're coming after farming. And if we continue on this path, now we're crying, that we are going to be dependent on China and Russia. Well, we'll be begging for pork from China and grains from Russia if we continue on this path. But I don't know, Mr. Manne, do you have any suggestions, what you think that is really reasonable and common sense? Because it is a very serious issue. And unfortunately, antitrust in many cases, it's not protecting competition, but competitors, and puts us in the middle of the global oligopolies.
You want to know what suggestions I might have to achieve
increase competition? We really need to protect competition, because all we're doing, setting prices, benefit, government controlled monopolies, and destroying the little guy.
Well, in the industry that I'm most familiar with, in the beef industry, I would say that I don't see any reason that there's no intervention we need to do to increase competition. There's lots of competition. Despite there being a small number of firms, it's well understood that number of firms does not correlate to the amount of competition, even though we hear that repeatedly. Everyone says 4 firms, 4 firms. Actually, it turns out that there are some studies, by the way, in the telecom industry that suggest 4 firms is the optimal number of firms for maximizing efficiency in a market. But regardless, there seems to be a lot of competition. I'm not sure what we should do to increase competition, but as I said before,
but I had an example. My farmer said that USDA precludes competition.
Yeah, exactly. I was just going to say.
But so you cannot say, as a little guy, and I don't know if you've been in business or not, but I've studied a lot of businesses. It is very difficult to go against big oligopolies that government controls, right, and they're very close to the government. And that is the biggest problem we have. It's not just because, we cannot just neglect and say, oh, markets are going to work. They do not exist in a lot of areas. I think my time had expired, but I would love to continue conversation and maybe have FTC looking into issues of anti-competitiveness created by our agency. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlelady yields back. I now recognize the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Demings, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And let me be clear on this. I don't want a government-controlled monopoly. I just want every Florida family to be able to afford a decent meal. Mr. Chairman, as all of you know, I think, I grew up in a rural part of Jacksonville, Florida, in a family that did not have a lot. So you can imagine food that was affordable was critical to our family. My parents grew vegetables, they raised chickens, they traded with neighbors, and relied on our local independent grocery stores. Coming together as a community, although it was tough many days, we were able to make it work. Now, I think every business wants to make a profit, but greed is a different thing. And that's what we are here to talk about today. We have seen consolidation of the people who buy crops and meats from our farmers and ranchers, giving them the power to squeeze both for greater profits for themselves and reduce profits for those they buy from. This is just wrong. The National Grocers Association confirmed that with limited supplies, independent grocery stores have not received their fair share, seeing whole pallets of the products missing from independent shelves in the big box retailers across the street. The evidence is clear. Big corporations have squeezed and continue to do so independent stores and food producers out of the marketplace, leaving us with a fragile food system. Mr. Maxwell, Florida has a significant agriculture economy, providing the state with a wide variety of safe and dependable food products and large and stable economic base. According to the USDA in 2019, Florida ranked first in the US in the value of production for bell peppers for fresh market, grapefruits, oranges, sugarcane, fresh market tomatoes and watermelons, second in the value of production for bell peppers, fresh market sweet corn and strawberries, and third in fresh market cabbage, peanuts, and squash. Mr. Maxwell, how does the consolidation of our food system from middleman to food companies to grocers affect the availability of fresh, healthy, and affordable food for Floridians and the livelihoods, we all should care about it, of Florida ranchers and farmers and the economy in Florida?
Thank you for the question. The issues that you present within your question clearly need to be framed within the domination that the dominant firms have, the CR4, and the power that they then have. As your farmers raise their produce, there are limitations in who will stand ready to buy that produce and then to process that produce. For the cattle producer, there's a limitation on the number of firms that will buy those fat cattle. You have great cattle production, beef production in the state of Florida, and it is getting more and more heavily concentrated. Farmers are facing harder and harder times to find a fair price. What it does to the consumer is that there's a bottleneck in the processing. These chains, these supply chains are so extended globally and nationally that it limits the amount of choices that a consumer has in a grocery store. Mr. Needler already testified on how he's not given the same fair deal for his opportunities to present to his customers as are the large box stores. So those bottlenecks in the supply chain create barriers for producers to access markets and consumers to access choices at the grocery store.
Mr. Maxwell, thank you so much. Mr. Needler, over the past several years, Florida has seen a reduction of grocers in many communities, leaving many Floridians in food deserts. How are small and independent grocers helping address the problem of food deserts, particularly in underserved communities, including rural areas like the one I grew up in?
Well, I think you should start by looking at one of the biggest issues with food deserts is once somebody's gone, the barrier to entry really is the capital intensity that's required to open the store. So independent retailers have been nimble enough to take on different formats and different types of stores. Like my example would be that we've grown over the years because I've been able to take on a different type of store, a smaller format, a bigger format, and we've been able to be nimble and try to serve the community with what we've got. We don't have to build a brand new store. We just try to step in and keep it going as long as we can, serve that community, nourish that community. So I think independent retailers have been more willing to try and take risk versus playing large scale capital allocations across markets.
Again, thank you all, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Bentz, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to the witnesses for this excellent hearing. Although I think the focus should be a little more on the opportunities that exist for folks on the smaller end of things. The reason I say that is because I am a member of a 5-generation ranch family from Oregon, and involved in the cow-calf producing space for many, many, many years. And I've watched as the family operation, of which I'm no longer a part, has grown from 600 mother cows to something in the 4,000 to 5,000 mother cow range, which of course one would suggest to listen to today's hearing is some horrible example of consolidation. But in point of fact, it's a reflection of what's been happening in the agricultural arena for a very long time. And I would take us back to the 30s when some 25% of all Americans were engaged in one way or another in farming, or 7 million family farms then and down to 2 million now. And I would just say that that's consolidation. But in addition, the price of food over that period of time has declined from 17.5% of a family's budget in 1960 to around 9.9% today. And so when we're here talking about how awful it is that people are paying more for groceries, I would simply say, gosh, look back to 1960. And I don't want to go back there. That's my point. Now, this is not to say that the packers or the feedlot operators or the retailers are above reproach. They're not. But there are ways of, I think, approaching what we're talking about today that will advance the interests of the producers and the interests of the American people without bringing more government into it. And with that as kind of the background, I'd like to turn to, I'll take Dr. Manne for a moment and ask him about the addition of some additional packing capacity. As I understand it, plants were already being built somewhere across the United States, some actually in Idaho, new packing plants that would add to the capacity of the nation when it comes to packing and also alternative places to take your cattle, and ask if that is kind of a natural process of our economy, Dr. Manne.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. When prices go up, of course, you see companies expanding to try to capitalize on that, and ultimately that drives prices down. Actually, in the meatpacking industry, it's sort of interesting. There's evidence to suggest that, there's been claims that following COVID and the price increases during COVID, the meat packers have sort of artificially constrained supply, in an effort to capitalize on increased prices by increasing prices even more. And the best studies on this point out that not only did that not happen, but the level of market power that existed before the pandemic would have suggested vastly larger increases in price than actually happened. So what it tells me is, it seems like, and who knows exactly what is motivating this, the beef packing industry is I mean, again, no one is above reproach, and there certainly have been problems there and elsewhere. But generally speaking, with respect to the pandemic response, they've been increasing capacity as much as possible. They have not been trying to constrain capacity. They're literally building new capacity, and I think really responding in a very commendable sort of fashion to an emergency situation that was certainly not of their making.
And I might say this is not limited just because of the nature of today's hearing. It might mislead folks to think that it is. This is not this higher price situation we find ourselves in. I would just simply talk about computer chips for a moment. And how about the automobile industry and what's happened to the cost of a used car? And why don't we haul all of the used car dealers in here and accuse them of gouging? Because I just noticed the other day when I went out to look for a used car that the price was up 37%. And so where's the hearing? And why aren't we running around there? The reason, of course, is I think we all understand that because of COVID, there was a movement away from contracting for computer chips, and now we're reaping the harvest of not having the meager harvest of not having those computer chips made here in the United States, among other things. And Mr. Chair, I just want to say, as a member of a community that relies upon cow-calf producers, I want to emphasize the packing space is not above reproach, but I think adding more capacity in these smaller plants is a really good step in the right direction. They were already coming along before COVID, and I wish them the very best because I think broader markets are good for all of us. But breaking things up, I don't want to go back to the 1930s. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for yielding back. And it's nice to hear a Republican member of this committee praising one of the Biden administration's initiatives on helping develop capital formation to bring more meatpacking operations into our country. So that was duly noted. And with that, I will recognize the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Gannon, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Cicilline. Concentration and consolidation in our food supply chain has been shown now to pose a serious threat to our food markets, the food industry workforce, and financial stability for the American consumer. Our ability to provide adequate and nutritious food to consumers is a matter of national security. So we need to act to ensure that the continuity of the industry is assured. The pandemic, as with so many other things, has highlighted the fragility of the U.S. food supply chain as meat processing plants, grocery stores, seed and grain markets, all of which have become steadily more concentrated in recent decades, were unable to meet demand, and Americans were left at various times with empty shelves and increasing costs. In a resilient and healthy food supply system, redundancy and diversity of suppliers would have helped to insulate consumers from the harmful costs or supply impacts of the pandemic and other similar events. More sources, processors, and distributors of food means that if something goes wrong in one part of the market, there are plenty of competing businesses to pick up the slack. In speaking with supermarket owners and operators and others in our food supply chain, we've seen the direct impact of industry concentration when something goes wrong, such as a COVID surge, leading to workers getting sick or having to take time off to take care of family members, which then reduces supply, which then increases prices. Additionally, in studying the concentration of the food supply chain, it's so important that we look at the impact on labor markets. Workers in meat processing and grocery industries have seen elevated levels of risk during the COVID-19 pandemic. But because just a few companies control such large shares of the grocery and meat processing markets, they're able to depress wages and subject their workers to poor working conditions. What we end up getting are companies in the national grocery chains that rely on a really perverse form of corporate welfare. They have a business model that relies on paying employees so little that they're forced to rely on food stamps and other government benefits. And studies show that the families of employees of some of these corporate giants often go hungry, while the employees are literally surrounded by food. This isn't just a perverse way to run a grocery business in the wealthiest nation in the world, it's immoral. We must have a food system in the US that respects the dignity of workers, is resilient even in the face of unprecedented supply chain shocks, and that provides affordable, quality food for all Americans. Addressing concentration within these markets is an important way to ensure a more secure food supply chain. And so I look forward to discussing with you some solutions to these problems. Ms. Johnson, I've spoken to independent and small grocers in my district about their challenges in getting supplies, and they've spoken at length about the impact of market concentration on the meat industry. And they were overwhelmingly of the opinion that the price increases we've seen lately have had a large part to do with that concentration because it's drastically reduced the number of meat packing plants and suppliers. And then when the pandemic hits those places, they don't have enough people to produce the pounds of protein that they're used to. And the need for social distancing further reduced their ability to produce the pounds of protein that they were used to. So the law of supply and demand then causes prices to rise. Both you and Mr. Needler have mentioned enforcement of existing antitrust laws as a tool to address shortages. Can you explain how that helps and what Congress might do or need to do to improve enforcement or give additional enforcement tools?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman, and I couldn't agree more with your comments. I think what's helpful here is to think in terms of fair and affordable prices and get out of this high-low dynamic. Because one point that we often miss is that the consumers who are struggling to afford food are also the workers who are having their wages depressed. So we need to align our enforcement strategies and complementary policies to ensure fair outcomes. It's not necessarily the case that we always want to seek the lowest possible price if that comes at the expense of health, of environmental protection, and foists other costs onto the public. That diverts public resources away from other social problems that urgently need attention, and it allows corporate profits to skyrocket. So we need to ensure that our enforcement approach addresses the tendency to externalize costs and to put those onto the public, and then at the same time invest in public policies that will support our workers and our consumers in ensuring that everyone can afford the food they need.
Thank you. I see my time has expired. I'll yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. I now recognize the ranking member of the Antitrust Subcommittee, the very distinguished gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Buck.
I thank the chairman, and I will pass, Mr. Chairman. I don't think I will have questions at any point. I thank the chairman for recognizing.
All right, the gentleman yields back. I now recognize Mr. Johnson from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. And I will note for the record that hardworking people across this country, including those who own family farms, are stressed out, working so hard that they are literally working themselves to death. And so, Ms. McClendon, I want to offer my condolences on the loss of your dear husband. As President Biden recently said, capitalism without competition isn't capitalism, it's exploitation. Ms. McClendon, the story you shared today about you and your husband's experience with Sanderson Farms is a classic case of exploitation. Would you agree?
Yes, sir, I would.
And in response to a question you were asked earlier, you said that although you are not a fan of government regulations, you feel that our government should do something to protect family farmers like you from exploitation by greedy corporations like Sanderson Farms, correct?
That is correct.
So Ms. McClendon, you would agree that it has not been too much government regulation that has hurt your business, but it's been a lack of adequate regulation that has hurt your business. Is that correct?
I would say that it is a lack of the enforcement of the laws that are already on the books.
All right, fair enough. I think it's quite telling that the two Republican witnesses testifying today are against regulations that promote competition. They're against enforcement of competition laws. And one of them testified point blank that the rise in consumer food prices is not caused by increased market concentration in the food industry. And the other Republican witness said that food production, particularly meat packing, is among the most competitive industries in America. Ms. McClendon, as the owner of a poultry farm, do you agree that market concentration in the poultry industry is killing your ability to make a fair profit?
Congressman, I am not qualified actually to answer that question. I am not overly familiar with all of the rules and regulations that are currently before Congress, and so I would decline to give an opinion on that.
Okay, well, thank you, ma'am. And Mr. Maxwell, what would you say in response to that question?
Well, thank you for the question, Representative. I believe that what we face in the poultry industry is extreme concentration and probably the best example of the abuse of power within agriculture. Either the power they have to deny workers bathroom breaks, the power they have to walk in and throw a contract down in front of a contract poultry grower and say, this is how much we're now going to pay you in spite of having millions borrowed. The power that they have over the grocery stores. Say again?
That's what happened to Ms. Sanderson, right? I mean, Ms. McClendon, correct?
Yes, that's exactly what happened to her. She's lived that experience. What we tried to present today is we can talk about economic theory, but these are the lived experiences and the outcomes of this very economic theory that some are defending today. These are real people, real impact on rural communities. Look at the hollowing out of rural America, the depopulation, the loss of tax base. It's because there are dominant firms that are controlling almost every aspect of rural life today.
Mr. Maxwell, would it be fair to say that the two Republican witnesses are not paying close attention to the reality on the ground of what's happening to family farmers like Ms. McClendon due to the anti-competitive concentration of the market concentration in the meat packing industry? That's the most significant driver of higher food prices for consumers and lower prices for farmers?
Well, I think that the witnesses that you've referenced are bringing their perspective as they know it through their academic education and their experiences within the segments of the industries that they have represented. What they don't bring here today is the lived experiences on the ground of the outcomes of the economic theories that rely upon certain assumptions. What I would ask those witnesses to do is go back and question the assumptions. Question the assumptions. Why is these the outcomes? Why did fertilizer costs go up 51%, but the cost of the gross margin, manufactured margin went up 680%, and farmers saw a doubling in prices? Go back and scratch your head and rethink the assumptions based upon your economic theory, because it's not playing out on the ground.
Well, the problem is money.
The time of the gentleman has expired.
Thank you.
I didn't mean to cut you off mid-sentence.
I just point out that the problem is money in politics. The big agribusinesses are paying for the regulations that are not being enforced to not be enforced. It's what they're doing, and then we've got two witnesses who are testifying on their behalf, and they happen to be Republican witnesses. And with that, I yield back.
All right, thank you. The gentleman yields back. I now ask unanimous consent to add a number of statements and letters regarding the harmful effects of consolidation on our nation's food supply to the hearing record. The first is a statement from Claire Kellaway, manager of the Fair Food and Farming Systems Program at the Open Markets Institute. Testimony from Rob LaRue, the president of the National Farmers Union. Statement from Bill Bullard, CEO of the Ranchers Cattlemen Action Legal Fund, United Stockgrowers of America. Testimony from Stephen Etka, policy director of the Campaign for Contract Agricultural Reform. Letter from George Slover, senior policy counsel, and Michael Hansen, senior scientist of food, both of Consumer Reports. A statement from the National Association of Convenience Stores. Statement from the National Sustainable Agricultural Coalition. Statement from a coalition of organic farmers from New England. Testimony from Margaret Crome Lukens, policy director, and Aaron Johnson, challenging corporate power program manager of the Rural Advancement Foundation International. Statement from Anthony Perrone, international president of the United Food and Commercial Workers International Union. Statement from Rhode Island resident Ruari Miller, owner of Union Burrito. A statement from Katie Barton, an advocate for individuals with disabilities. And finally, testimony from Amanda Hitt, the director of Food Integrity Campaign at the Government Accountability Project. Without objection, I want to thank the witnesses for their testimony today and my colleagues on both sides of the aisle for participating in this hearing. Today, we had the opportunity to hear firsthand from farmers, experts, and business owners on the effects of economic concentration on America's food supply. This hearing has made clear that our food system is in crisis, harming consumers and small businesses throughout the supply chain. Excess concentration has caused not only rising prices, but also harms to the environment, our health, worker safety, and the stability of the entire food system. Unprecedented concentration and vertical integration at every link of the supply chain threatens our economic system by eliminating competitive markets, threatens the livelihood of farmers by squeezing them at both ends, buying and selling, particularly impacting farmers of color. Independent grocers and small retail outlets are struggling to stock their shelves and keep their doors open, in part because dominant big box chains and large suppliers abuse their power to force small retailers to pay higher prices for products or withhold products from them entirely. Small poultry farmers are living in poverty and struggling to survive because a handful of vertically integrated firms control every stage of the supply chain. The outsized control of America's supply by a handful of immensely powerful companies has also made clear that we need real solutions to these problems. From strengthening our antitrust laws to outlawing abusive practices in the marketplace, we need to make sure our nation's competition system and economy works for everyone. It also underscored the dire need for reforms across the board, implementing President Biden's 4-point plan to lower food prices and creating choice for hardworking Americans to tackle price gouging and other symptoms of corporate profiteering. Again, thank you to our witnesses for the extraordinary testimony. This concludes today's hearings. Again,